Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Our mainstream account tells us that in the earliest days of our civilization we built pyramids during the Bronze Age. After the Bronze Age, we slowly advanced to the time of the Roman Republic that eventually became the Roman Empire, and the sort of structures that we built changed radically. We advanced to building smaller structures that were not quite as geometrically precise as the earlier pyramids, and yet they're very fine structures with great domes and magnificent colossal forms to them that endure to this day. And let's also take time to appreciate the wondrous Roman roads, many of which that also continue to endure to this day. Everywhere we go around the land, we'll see the ruins of the previous civilization. And yes, that includes the United States and the Americas, even though it's called the New World. Although new as opposed to what is certainly a question of the day. Today we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The channel originally started with the charter of examining numerous different theories. And you can go back and watch the video that's linked in the description of this video called The Grand Theories of Tartaria and the Old World, in which we explored the many different theories that could explain the existence of pre-existing civilizations that were not explained in the mainstream. Think about the aspect of a cemetery. You believe that a cemetery gives you validation that the history that you're told is accurate because every time someone you know passes away, they're buried in a cemetery with a date that's left on the tombstone. Therefore, older tombstones must be validation that what happened in the past historical account is accurate. Although would you be surprised to know that virtually every cemetery across the lands has been moved at some point in time for a variety of reasons. We have now advanced to building wondrous towers of glass and steel that cross the land. And yet, can we actually build these incredible pyramids that we did in the distant past during the Bronze Age? How does the mainstream account explain the construction of these pyramids? Indeed, we are derided for even questioning the account that we're given for how the pyramids were constructed. We are derided and told that it's merely a conspiracy theory. Yet at the same time, the mainstream tries to explain the pyramids with theories. In other words, they don't know for sure. But it's okay for them to come up with theories because their theories are validated by scientists, historians, archaeologists, and all the individuals with the appropriate credentials to do such things. So you look at the pyramids and you'll see that it's made up of many large stones that had to be moved. And they explain this by telling us that the quarries were nearby. They also have these wondrous images that we have that show human labor moving these great blocks. And then we have these beautiful animations that show us how they used a wonderful waterworks project to move these blocks and set them in place. And doesn't that illustration look great of those giant colossal people? And when you look at these illustrations and you have this wonderful account that tells you that water may have moved the blocks in place with human labor, it suddenly seems very believable, and you'll just accept it without asking questions. Of course, this image looks ridiculous. We could never build the pyramids like this today. So if we can't do it with human labor, and we base everything on this supposed representation from a governor of Egypt that existed 2,000 years before the year 0, or so we're told, and then it was some Greek individual who came up with a theory on how they moved the blocks using ramps, even though he was theorizing about an event that occurred 2,000 years before he was alive, and then this Greek individual is also 2,000 years before our current time, I don't see any issues with the mainstream account of the pyramids. Now, if you want a different theory, we're going to examine the 5 eras theory. The 5 eras theory examines the fact that there are civilizations that came before ours that we don't discuss, that the mainstream does not acknowledge. And the reason for that being is that because if you actually acknowledge the existence of other civilizations where people lived in a different fashion, then it completely detracts from your ability to maintain your control over the population. The eras that we talk about the most and we'll examine on the channel are the contemporary era, our current era, the 5th era, and the 4th era, or also known as the Tartarian era or the Monument era. These are the most dramatic eras to talk about, and we also have the most evidence. But we're also going to consider the foundation eras, the 1st through the 3rd eras. And we call them the foundation eras because they were the original foundations that both the 4th era and the 5th era were built on top of. And we can still see their remnants. Indeed, we speculate that the pyramids are actually the remnants of the 2nd era civilization, or the foundation era. And yet there are other examples of incredible geometric structures that endure. Consider what we have in the 5th era with our great cities of glass and steel, and yet something about them seems very disposable and uninspired. What's the primary form of architecture? We have nothing but wonderful brutalist architecture. Brutalist architecture, called as such because it is functional, and it's also cost-effective. What's truly intriguing to consider, though, about the prospect of brutalist architecture is how it's risen across the world, and its heyday was considered after World War II in both the United States and the Soviet Union. And despite the fact that these were two diametrically opposed ideologies and nations, for a variety of reasons, they somehow embraced the same type of architecture, supposedly at different times and for different reasons that happen to support their respective economic systems. Even in Pittsburgh, where we saw the beautiful Cathedral of Learning, we have this wonderful glass tower that we can look at and we can act like it really compares with the Cathedral of Learning. And then we have many other wondrous structures where great residences live in. It looks nice and rounded and cubed and very, very boring. Sometimes you have to remember, though, that there is inspired architecture in brutalist architecture. It looks like we have what appears to be some sort of broken down TIE fighter here. And what does it represent? I don't know. Looking at the rest of the architecture, you need go no further than consider the dystopian film A Clockwork Orange. A Clockwork Orange, which talked about how a society repressed and controlled an individual, and it used this architecture quite effectively to show how individuals were controlled and how ultimately the violence that was inflicted on others was all at the behest of the government. And if you pay attention to the subtext in the movie A Clockwork Orange, you'll see that the architecture plays no small part in representing that. And there's no doubt about it that brutalist architecture can certainly reflect a dystopian flavor to a society, if you will. Now, is this going a little too far? Is this being a little too harsh on brutalist architecture? It has its place, it's functional, and it's cheap. At least that's what we'll be told. Although there are conflicting accounts given as to why it was embraced. For example, you'll be told that in the Western world, the United States, brutalist architecture was embraced because it was cheaper, and there was a demand for residences. And then in the Soviet Union, or the so-called communist bloc at the time, you'll be told that brutalist architecture was embraced because it was all for the good of the state, and it was for allowing individuals and workers to all have the same standard of living. And as much as we believe both of these diametrically opposed ideologies embracing the exact same architecture as the main reason for why we have numerous examples of brutalist architecture, we see that it represents the Fifth Era. And in fact, many offshoots of what they used to call brutalist architecture still exist to this day. And you need look no further in the United States than a Holiday Inn Express or any of these newer modern hotels or residential areas, where you can find that it's not really dystopian living, it's merely common sense. It makes perfect sense. It's cheaper. And it's always good to have disposable buildings. It's also good to have buildings with the fine functional lines of brutalism in the background for when you're engaging on your individual walks for fun. But why is brutalist architecture considered something that's an advancement? For two reasons. One, we're told that it reflected the economic realities in the entire world from the 1950s to the 1970s. And two, we're just told that it's a lot more practical. We don't want to build architecture that has an artistic appeal to it. Practicality, cost savings, and being economically viable. That's what really matters. And when you have a lot of people that need housing, you're going to shove them in very block-like housing units that all look the same. And this will inspire people. And indeed, the actual housing units that were used to film A Clockwork Orange still have that same dystopian look to them in the present. Now, it's my opinion. Perhaps this is a utopian appearance to you. Perhaps you think that that beautiful Freedom Tower in New York City is an improvement over the structures that preceded it. We've looked at the skyline of New York City in the early 20th century. And tell me, is there a comparison? Do any of these many residential high-rises actually compare to the previous residences that we had all over the Western world and the Eastern world from the times past? We'll be told that this was merely a necessity, that this was done for the good of people, that this represented the will of the people, not just in the United States, but in the Soviet Union. Now let's look at the Art Deco question. Is Art Deco from the Fifth Era or the Fourth Era? Art Deco is very intriguing because it has conflicting accounts for what it really represents. It has conflicting accounts for what styles actually go into Art Deco. When we look at Art Deco, though, we see something very different than brutalist or postmodern. We see an architectural style that reflects artistic inspiration, something that reflects a civilization that genuinely cares about the structures that it's building, that the structures are supposed to have more of a function than just be utilitarian, as we're relentlessly told that brutalist architecture serves. We see a style and a beauty in these Art Deco buildings that seem to speak to the human spirit. When you look at these buildings, you can't help but be impressed, and you feel that a lot more effort was put into their exterior and interior designs. You actually see the fact that there is the true human spirit that's reflected in these buildings. And oftentimes people will try to convince you that these buildings were all easily built primarily in the United States during the 1920s, and you can even find a great example of one built in the Soviet Union in the 1940s to the early 1950s. Yet, looking at the Art Deco style, you can see that there is something about it that is always awe-inspiring. And it's very difficult to accept the explanation that all these buildings were built with these very wonderful and convincing construction photos that we have. And even though this was only about 100 years ago, it still falls in a very ambiguous time. Did our civilization build these buildings? Or are we simply told that they built these buildings? How much of a deception do we have with the actual timeline? And can we really validate or verify anything? Now, it's very interesting to me because since I've done many of these explorations and we've primarily looked at many cities in the United States, we've started to look at cities in Europe and in Asia, we always have the same explanation and always have the same things that you see in the comments. And I'm going to let you in on something. There's actually a comment somebody could make that would convince me over 90% that any one of these Art Deco buildings were built by our civilization. But it's quite fascinating that not a single person has ever made that comment. And it's really quite simple, and I'm not going to tell you what that comment is. I'll let you know if somebody makes the comment, but you can find an example of it in one of the videos concerning an Iowa exploration because somebody made a comment that very convincingly showed that the 801 Grand Building in Des Moines was built by our civilization. And yet there's so many questions that come up with these Art Deco buildings. They continue to show the aspect of the civilization that preceded ours. I believe that by and large, most of these structures are from the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization that preceded our 5th era. And why do I think that? Because these buildings do reflect the style of what we would call the Old World. They have that artistic spirit, that inspiration in every single one of them. And it's not just on the exteriors of the buildings, it's also in the interior where you see how they reflect the once grandeur of civilization. A civilization that cared about the individual, not constantly being in a state of function or a state of misery, but being able to inspire the spirit on the inside. No doubt when you're in an Art Deco building as opposed to when you're in a brutalist architecture building, you can tell the difference. You can also compare and contrast how you feel when you stand outside an Art Deco building as opposed to a brutalist building. And when you see some of the examples of Art Deco, the explanation you'll be given from architects is that they had more of an artistic flair in the 1920s to incorporate all these incredible styles that even include Egyptian, strangely enough, because we do recall the civil courts building in St. Louis that we looked at that was modeled after the mausoleum of Helicanarsis, which supposedly doesn't have anything to do with Egypt, but it does. And that's according to the mainstream account. There's always these beautiful reliefs that also accompany Art Deco. The wondrous figures that you see depicted on the outside of the buildings. And these buildings have many different functions. Some are office buildings, some are municipal buildings, some are memorials, yet the style is reflected in the same. And while they try to tell us exactly what it's supposed to reflect, and of course they give us the hand wave explanation that the reason it reflects every civilization and culture across the world is because of course it incorporates every civilization and culture across the world. That's how you explain Art Deco. It's not because it's actually from a civilization that encompassed all the known lands. It's because somebody was trying to achieve cultural understanding in the 1920s, especially in the United States. The interiors of some of these buildings continue to inspire us. Now, why do I acknowledge the fact that some of these buildings may be questionable? Because we constantly run across the situation where we're told, we are assured in the same manner with repeated statements that many of these buildings, and here we look at the main building of the Moscow University, a questionable building, we're told that this individual, Joseph Stalin, was responsible for its construction. And once Joseph Stalin had passed on, then the Soviet Union completely embraced brutalist architecture. Indeed, it's an individual that we always explain it. Remember during the Kansas City exploration where we saw some very stunning Art Deco buildings, including the Power and Light building in the aptly named Power and Light district within Kansas City. I would be interested to see someone actually be able to build a building like this today. I would like to see someone build this very impressive theater that still endures with this very unique dome, again in Kansas City. Interesting patterns that we see in the windows, and of course the type of construction material that was used to establish the walls and the dome itself. And let's not forget the Kansas City Hall. The Kansas City Hall also being a stellar example of Art Deco. And where do you see it? You see it in the art reliefs, and you also see it in the walls of the building going all the way to the top. So you can prove that there is a skyscraper that's a lot more than just a functional building. You can see there are aspects of it that truly reflect a different civilization, unless we're to believe it's our own civilization. Kansas City has its own version of Joseph Stalin, Tom Pendergast. Tom Pendergast, who was a mafia and political machine organizer in Kansas City and supposedly responsible for the presidency of Harry S. Truman. Of course, it didn't save this particular individual from serving time in prison for tax evasion. So really, was Joseph Stalin and Tom Pendergast responsible for the Art Deco buildings, or were they just the people that we say are responsible? We have many photos of the construction of the Art Deco buildings, and supposedly we have many accounts. Although, oddly enough, no one seems to provide a first-person account. And now let's consider the Fourth Era proper. This is the era that we call the Tartarian era. This is the civilization that preceded ours. There was a hard reset that occurred in a time frame from 1750 to 1850, although it's hard to say for sure. We have wondrous examples of what the Tartarian civilization may have looked like. Very incredible architecture, stretching to the sky, various forms of producing power. We've explored it in great detail about how this pre-existing civilization managed to achieve a balance between both nature and the artificial implements of its civilization. It also managed to achieve the very elusive balance, for a time, between the individual and society. And that's something that our current civilization tends to go away from in every direction that you can imagine, especially given the fact that it oftentimes defaults to extreme polarizations and someone always having to be right and someone always having to be wrong. And you always have to embrace a belief now, and it's completely wrong to remain undecided about something. We'll still see examples of this Tartarian civilization even in some older images that we have, such as this image that may or may not have problems with it, of an airship docking with the Empire State Building. We also have other examples of airships docking with various towers. So is this really a brief technological fad according to our mainstream account? Or was this a real technological advancement that carried over from the Fourth Era civilization that had to be removed? We've looked at many examples of buildings that still stand to this day that we suspect are from this pre-existing civilization. Consider the Art Deco buildings that we looked at that are very likely from the Fourth Era civilization. We've also explored many libraries and municipal buildings in many cities, such as Terminal Tower in Cleveland. And many people will insist that they have numerous accounts, or because they worked a job in the building, that they can prove that it was constructed by our civilization, even though all we have are some very difficult to interpret images. And once again, we have, strangely enough, no first-hand accounts. Well, I understand the 1930s was a long time ago. And again, we have other images of this terminal tower. And many people will say that they just know, or they know someone who knows someone who knows someone, and that's what they'll say. And if that's good enough for you with historical account, then by all means accept it. But yet you have many other structures that also seem to defy simple explanation by their incredible architectural style, and all supposedly built during the same time, such as the Masonic Temple in Detroit that we explored. Another wonder of the 1920s, when it seemed as though they built 75% of the buildings in every major city in the Midwest of the United States. We do have a construction photo of it, and once again we see that there are no issues with this construction photo. It is very convincing, and of course that's usually what you'll have when you explore these structures. Remember the wondrous interior that we looked at. And again, I believe this interior gives us true evidence of a pre-existing civilization that has been repurposed and used by the organizations in our current civilization. And here you look at this theater in the same structure, And again, a very impressive and beautiful theater. Certainly there's nothing that we've built since the 1960s that remotely compares to this. This impressive structure in Cincinnati that will be told is an arch or waterworks, it is most certainly not a castle, because somebody says so. And in Cincinnati, where we have this impressive church from the 1840s next to the city hall. And of course, the explanation will be given is that we had those crafty Germans that could build in Greco-Roman style and lay out a wonderful church like this in the 1840s with very impressive columns and the roof that we've seen. And there's absolutely no question about this. You just accept it. Or you can ask questions, such as looking at the Fox Theater in Atlanta, and realize that perhaps all the explanations that were given for who was truly responsible for these structures is not as simple or as cut and dry as it seems. Indeed, looking at the Fulton County Prison in Atlanta, or near what would become Atlanta, we can see evidence of a different civilization. Don't even bother asking why you'd need a tower on a prison like that, because it makes perfect sense. And now we look at the Foundation eras, the third to the first era. Now, the Foundation eras may not seem as dramatic as either the Tartarian era or the Contemporary era because we don't have as much direct evidence. But we still have a lot of direct evidence that indicates that there was an era that preceded the civilization that came before us. And this is in the many examples that we have of what we call star forts, or as this channel refers to them now, geometrically precise foundation structures. And the reason we call them geometrically precise foundation structures on this channel is because they are very geometrically precise. We can tell that these are artificial constructs. And in every major city, there is some sort of documentation that indicates that there is a geometrically precise foundation structure that surrounds the city. And quite impressively so, we can find it in cities across the land. In cities in the United States, in Germany, in Russia, the former Soviet Union, across many other lands. And the explanation will be given for these geometrically precise foundation structures that surround the entire city is because it was good practice. They were defensible. It's how you would defend against cannonballs. And yet, conversely, you can find some structures that had signs of these geometrically precise foundation structures, or the smaller star forts, as you will, during the United States Civil War, which, strangely enough, were overrun or overtaken by a direct tactical military assault. So it's very strange. Once again, it's the example of a conflicting account. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's fine. You have these maps, and yes, perhaps they were just drawn. And yet we do have actual imagery that shows that these geometrically precise foundation structures at that scale are quite real. There are many examples of them across the entire land. And you can find them around cities, around old fortresses, or at least what we're told are old fortresses or castles, as there are so many castles, since everybody seemed to be able to afford to build one during what were called medieval times. And yet you can see the geometrical precision, and you can see the amalgamation of artificial with the natural. And perhaps this is also the explanation for the large and long, numerous so-called sandbars that we have that run for miles, and in some cases 40 to 50 miles. And you can also see the precision within the remaining structures. There are so many examples of these geometrically precise foundation structures that we can't simply explain, surrounding small towns, surrounding cities, the remnants of what used to be walls. Yet it's integrated with the terrain, and we can also tell that there are buildings that were built on top of these structures in the past. And that's where we get the title the Foundation Era from. It was the third era that the foundation that our previous civilization, the Tartarian era, and then our current era, built on top of, or in lieu of. And when you can see this across the land, and you can see so many examples, it completely contradicts the mainstream account that we're given. Also the fact that it's overgrown and it's integrated with nature. Now, of course, people say, well, there's a reason for it. It was just built before, and it was done with the ability to build walls because there were so many skilled construction individuals during the Middle Ages all the way up to the 1700s. And building these forts, regardless of logistical challenges, were never an issue. In fact, logistics is one of the greatest aspects that's hand-waved away. Now, they explain it with the Egyptian pyramids by saying that the quarry was right there. Well, it doesn't matter if the quarry was right next to the pyramids, which they try to tell us or imply that it was. You still have to cut all those blocks. You still have to move all those blocks, and you still have to form the pyramids, much as you have to form the land and the artificial structures of this geometrically precise foundation structure that goes around what appears to be this settlement and this structure. So is it really that simple to explain, or is it just a matter of accepting what you're told because it's the path of least resistance? And oftentimes that's what we find ourselves doing. And if you assess that's what you need to do to achieve happiness in your life is simply to capitulate to the will of others, then so be it. The second era gives us the example of where we have the pyramids from, and it no doubt reached heights that we can only begin to dream of. Now we suspect that there are a few remnants of the second era. We're told by the very same mainstream account that tells us of how the pyramids were constructed that they once had even more beauty to them, that they once appeared to have a great outer structure. But also imagine if they had this ability to build pyramids, what could they have achieved and how many ubiquitous structures could they have built using the geometric precision of pyramids? You also have to think in a much larger scale too. Because while people will try to say that we never achieved a great building scale, yet we're still able to conceive a larger building scale. In other words, imagine pyramids that would start to match the size of hills or even small mountains, and then integrate a technological component with them. Integrate the aspect of power resources. And when you look inside the existing pyramids that remain, you see a very complicated architecture that went into establishing them. And of course we're told, well, it's because it was a tomb and the pharaoh liked their pyramids and they wanted to have a very elaborate tomb. And the thought of rebellion because they were facing death never crossed anyone's minds. Well, except for a few select individuals. But what if it was very different? What if this was a civilization that existed in even more balance between the individual and the society, and it achieved even more balance between nature and the artificial? And what if what we refer to as the Mayan civilization was actually just a component of the second era civilization? What if all the descendants that came from it and its long timeline actually came from the second era? Think on this. Instead of this being a less advanced civilization, this was a far more advanced civilization. Again, it flies right in the face of what we're given from the mainstream account that provides us depictions such as this. And depictions such as this, even though no one will ever do a practical experiment to prove how possible this is, that will convince us that this was how the pyramids were built. But what if they had construction techniques that we have absolutely no knowledge of? The ability to produce construction materials that far exceed anything we can begin to imagine. And we're not even talking about the original Rossendale cement, or the Rossendale concrete as we called it, or the Roman concrete. We're talking about something even more advanced than that. And here we have the depiction that shows us what the original pyramids supposedly looked like. And there's no doubt that they had this level of grandeur. Perhaps they had even more grandeur. Maybe they were coated in something that looked like gold. We'll still certainly consider all the other theories that we have, even though the 5 eras theory seems to be quite solid, at least from our observations. The important thing is that we retain open minds. While we're visualizing what the previous eras, especially the Foundation eras, may have appeared like, what we're going off of for our evidence is some of the foundation rocks that we have, many of the other impressive structures that no doubt existed in these previous civilizations. What we see remain are not the full structures in their glory. We see the smaller structures that have somehow survived the passage of time and at least 2, perhaps 3 resets. And something else I'll concede with this 5 eras theory. For all we know, there could have been many more eras. There could have been 10, there could have been 20, there could have been 30, or even 100. And another question might be, well, how exactly does other timelines fit into this 5 eras theory? Well, when you consider the fact that San Francisco is considered to be one of the most exquisite cities of our current civilization, and yet nothing about it even compares with what we had in the past. Finally, let's consider the first era. The first era seems to be the era that we have the greatest difficulty imagining. And the reason for that is because the first era, no doubt, reflected the greatest balance It's safe to say that a lot of what we have in our current civilization encourages us not to ever believe that there were buildings that were the size of mountains, even though we're told that in the future we'll envision buildings that are the size of mountains, and architects supposedly already have. Or did they derive this inspiration from something that existed in the past and was described in the past? Described in many different old accounts of structures that were so large that they actually exceeded the size of mountains. We even have the account of the Beacon of Progress, supposedly just a drawing, a sketch, a concept for an incredible monument that was going to be reflected in the Chicago World's Fair, along with many other wondrous structures. We also have the religious accounts of the great religions of the land that tell us of great cities and celestial kingdoms in the past. Are they really referring to the actual celestial kingdom, or are they referring to cities that may have existed? Cities in the distant past that really were of a grander and greater glory than we can ever imagine, because we had a civilization of individuals that had achieved balance between both their individual desires and the needs and wants of a society. You might look at rock faces such as this and you would think, no, it's merely a natural formation, or perhaps it reflects some sort of old, large tree, and perhaps it does. However, there's another approach that you could say it reflects a once great and amazing structure that's been through 4 or 5 hard resets, or maybe more. The difficult thing about envisioning the first era is the fact that we've had many resets and it's been a long time. Now, how long is that exactly? The main question might be, how many years do I envision in these 5 eras total? Well, we just don't know, and I know that's not the answer that anybody would want, but that's the honest answer, because we talked about in the date paradox how we don't know how many years have passed. We don't know how many years are in each of these eras. 1,000 years, 5,000 years, 5 million years? Could the entire 5 eras only be 6,000 years? Or could it be many more, 600,000 years? Is it a millennial reign of only 1,000 years? Or is it a millennial reign of 1,000 centuries? Or even a far greater amount of time? We just don't know. And the difficult thing with considering time is how quickly things can become obscured, where we're reliant on other people, governments, institutions that were told relentlessly by other historical authorities that were corrupt, that were, excuse the pun, evil. Evil in every way, shape, and form, and yet we're supposed to believe that they preserved an accurate account of history to hand down to us? Because even if you prescribe to the mindset that all of our current governments and civilizations are completely incorruptible and everything they do is for the good and represents the will of the people, regardless of national divisions that we're constantly given, how exactly can you accept the fact that previous civilizations and governments that existed handed us an honest account? I suppose what I'm saying is the 5 eras theory is the best way that we can visualize what may have come before. And I'm always open to revising it and reconsidering it. And as we continue our explorations, we're going to primarily consider the 5 eras theory, because it does seem to explain a lot of the inconsistencies that we have. Now, if you want to reference one particular publication, one particular guide, or what one certain researcher says, that's completely up to you. And I completely request that everybody in the comments tell me what your honest thoughts are. What do you believe? Where do you think the 5 eras fits into the actual history? Is it honest? Is it accurate? Or do we have other difficulties? Do we have other complexities that we need to consider within what the actual timeline is? The last thing I'm ever going to do, though, is simply give up and stop asking questions and stop exploring, because we've already learned so much, and we've already learned to see the world in a very different way. And of course, there's going to be people, there'll even be institutions that'll tell us that we shouldn't see the world in this way. What did the collapse of the First Era really look like? We can imagine it. We can believe it was brought about by some hard natural force, or maybe it was brought about by a natural force and the internal corruption of the people on a long enough timeline. It is indeed a recurring theme in virtually every cultural and religious account that we have in our modern era. Consider what was really lost in the past. And I think that's the greatest theme of this research going forward, and this is why this is a very exciting exploration that we continue. We've explored many aspects of Tartaria on this channel before. We've also done theory videos where we've looked at what Tartaria looked like prior to the last reset. This channel calls Tartaria as our fourth era, or the civilization that preceded our current civilization. We believe it reached great heights. Heights that we can't even begin to imagine, with incredible airships and spectacular architecture and technology. And yet we can still see that Tartaria fell. What was the reason it fell? What were some of the challenges that it faced? We've posited a potential timeline for Tartaria, and we believe that there was a great conflict that occurred during its second phase of its civilization, or the ascendancy period, when Tartaria reached the very height of its civilization. What was really the nature of this conflict, and what gave us an indication that there was a great conflict that occurred? And how do we know that Tartaria prevailed in this conflict? This is a theory video, but I think it's an important theory video because we do have many signs around the lands and our remaining architectures, and we'll be examining our great monuments and the symbolism behind those monuments that indicate to us that there was a great conflict that occurred during the ascendancy phase of Tartaria. We still see the remnants everywhere we look of the architecture of this civilization that preceded ours. We'll be assured by our mainstream that this wondrous architecture was merely the results of hard work and the earlier phase of our own civilization. And yet there are so many signs in it that we just don't fully recognize. There are so many things that just don't seem to make sense or match what we're told their origin tends to be. For example, the great fortresses all across the lands that we're told were built during medieval times or even earlier, yet by people who didn't possess the wonders and the benefits of the so-called Industrial Revolution, people who lacked logistical capacity, and yet there seemed to be no limits behind what they could achieve if they simply focused their minds on it. At the same time, we're also going to consider the fact that many of these structures are without a doubt the remnants of the Tartarian civilization that preceded ours. The signs are in their architectural capacity, their remote location, and the fact that many of these structures simply cannot be explained, not even by our current methods, in the modern era after the Industrial Revolution. These are structures that were completed by a civilization that not only possessed a wondrous technological know-how, building capacity, and architecture that we can only begin to imagine, but they also had an incredible civilization and a society. In today's video, we're going to be exploring one of the greatest challenges that society faced, and the unified civilization of humanity in the past era managed to overcome. We're also going to speculate in terms of who the adversary was that they actually faced. And while we've explored that on the channel before, today's exploration is going to look a little deeper and try to posit some more theories on that aspect as we look at the great conflict and Tartaria's triumph. This is the monument to the Battle of the Nations. We're told it was built in Leipzig, Germany from 1898 to 1913. It's to commemorate the great victory over Napoleon, who we explored earlier this week. The attention we have towards this monument, though, is if we examine it in close detail, we see that there are many aspects of it that defy the explanation that this is truly a monument that is built to commemorate the Napoleonic conflict, or the Battle of the Nations that occurred towards the end of it. We see that there are many fine details with the figures on this monument that don't seem to match what we would expect soldiers to be wearing during the Napoleonic conflict. Indeed, we see figures wearing suits of armor, carrying swords, in direct contravention to what we're told the primary weapon being used during the Napoleonic conflict was. Now, of course, we'll be told that this is merely an idyllic representation, that this is to inspire us in the monument, to show us true commemoration of the soldiers that served during the Napoleonic conflict. Yet we have armored knights and we have what appear to be lions. We do have some construction photos of this monument to the Battle of the Nations. Yet at the same time, we have the usual challenges that we do when we examine these construction photos. Does scaffolding really prove construction? Does a big hole in the ground in some non-discrete location really show construction? There's also an odd issuing with scaling. This monument is nearly 300 feet high, and the stones and the masonry used in it appear to be far older than what we're told. We see figures that do not match anything from the Napoleonic Wars, and we see a structure that seems to commemorate something else. Is this supposed to be some sort of monument that was built during the medieval period? Because these figures that we see depicted on this monument look as though they would reflect some great medieval battle. Perhaps the Duke of Austria or the King of the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, I know it was an emperor, but I'm just merely making fun at all the inconsistencies within the monument. It's a very impressive monument, and you see that the construction behind it is truly extraordinary. Not something we'd expect to have happen from 1898 to 1913, completed just in time before the First World War, a monument to potentially an earlier world war. Or was this really a monument to any world war that our civilization knows of? What if this was truly a monument that was actually established by the civilization that preceded ours, the Tartarian civilization? Now I know to new viewers of the channel what I'm suggesting might be absurd and it might be offensive. But when we have observations of many of the figures that we see in this monument that just don't seem to make any kind of sense, what exactly is this figure here supposed to be representing from the Napoleonic conflict? This is not anything we have any account of, and even looking inside the monument, aside from truly impressive architecture, we see figures and representations that make absolutely no sense. They do not represent directly what we visualize as the soldiers that took part in the Napoleonic conflict. Where's the very well-dressed Duke of Wellington? Where's Admiral Nelson? Where's Prussian Field Marshal Blücher? This doesn't look anything like Field Marshal Blücher, or Wellington, or anyone else who participated in the Napoleonic conflict. So ask yourselves, what's really being depicted here? Is this just supposed to be some ideal representation of what transpired in the Napoleonic conflict? Or are these figures representing something completely different? Are they representing another civilization celebrating a great victory and triumph? When you examine these figures closely, and you consider what they may be representing, the symbolism behind them, you realize that there is a very strong possibility that they are depicting something from that Tartarian civilization that preceded ours. A civilization that valued life, that valued a unified societal effort and a great struggle that they faced. Who exactly was the adversary, though? And why do we believe that this monument to the Battle of the Nations really reflects them? Well, when it comes down to it, you analyze all these figures, and it's very difficult to find any sort of symbolism that matches that particular time frame. Now, of course, the official explanation will tell us that these figures merely represented the ideal times of German artwork from the late 19th and early 20th century, and it makes perfect sense. And of course, since people worked harder and there was no other needs going on in the German Empire at that time prior to World War I, or their great effort towards colonialism, that they could afford to build a monument like this, and do it quite easily. And these figures are merely representations of all the soldiers that served in the Napoleonic conflict. You don't need to build an exact representation, much like in the U.S. Civil War monuments, of which there are so many. Ubiquitous Civil War monuments that you can find in every courthouse in the United States. They always seem to be a column, and they always seem to have some sort of figure that is attached to the top. It's rather odd, though, because it seems as though that the Civil War monuments feel as though the actual base was already established, and then there were add-ons or modifications. Now, in some monuments, this shows a little bit more than others. These monuments are always called the Soldiers and Sailors monuments, and you can find them across the land. The most prominent one that we looked at in previous explorations on this channel being the Soldiers and Sailors monument in Indianapolis, Indiana. A very impressive and tall column adorned with numerous decorations. Now, to be fair and objective, some of the decorations towards the base do appear as Union soldiers. They do reflect what we'd expect to see from the nature of the Civil War. But the larger figures and the base stones don't seem to reflect that. And the figure on top of this very impressive monument most certainly does not seem to reflect anything from the Civil War. And we look at its very questionable construction and the so-called documentation of it, and there seems to be so many difficulties in simply explaining it. We also have accounts of other Civil War monuments that, due to the how shall we say, changing perceptions of the time, have been modified by having the statues removed from them, as we can see in this impressive column of what used to be a Confederate monument. Yet if you just pull off the statue, what do you have? You still have the baseline column. Was there something else that was once on top of this column? Notice that they're also using a high-powered modern crane. There are many Civil War monuments across our favorite state to explore, Iowa. And the reason we say Iowa is our favorite state to explore is because that's where all the exploration started. And naturally, they have a very impressive Soldiers and Sailors monument out in front of the Iowa State Capitol as well, almost looking like you're in Rome. The Soldiers and Sailors monument in Iowa we've looked at in a very early exploration on the channel. Now, this is certainly one that is very difficult to explain because we have this statue of Iowa. This was made in the 1890s. How exactly, given what we know of the society in the 1890s, would this have been appropriate or tolerated at that time? At that time, we're told that it was very inappropriate for a lady to show even her ankle, and yet here we have full frontal nudity being depicted. Other aspects of this monument don't really make a lot of sense, such as this figure we have that looks like Julius Caesar on the back. Now, we do have Civil War soldiers and some strange portraits that are put on it. But I'm not beginning to question if this monument was modified, that they had the statues that didn't make any sense and then changed them. And this other monument that's supposedly to a leading political figure in Iowa earlier in its history, and how exactly do any of the figures on this part of the monument make sense? There's also the Sergeant Floyd Monument, yet another obelisk that's located in Council Bluffs, Iowa. This is supposed to be dedicated to a fallen member of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So let me get this straight. A non-commissioned officer in the United States who died in the early 19th century has a very large obelisk dedicated to them as a monument and a memorial. Is that really what this is all about? Now, I know there's many different theories behind what obelisks could really represent and the power structure that they may represent. But for this exploration, let's just look at the fact and consider that the obelisk really is a monument. Here we actually have a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers officer with facial hair, obviously before World War I. And yet we're told that the credit for this monument, that it was done in the early 1900s to commemorate Sergeant Floyd, who had fallen during the Lewis and Clark expedition. Now, granted, it's not an impressive obelisk that's the height of the Washington Monument that we looked at, but it's still impressive nonetheless. We also have other monuments that seem to indicate some sort of victory, and on many of the triumphal arches you see figures like this. But why are we always representing Rome? Well, if we look at our 5 eras theory that we go off of on the channel as the baseline of our explorations, we can see that the Tartarian era is the era that preceded ours, or the civilization that preceded ours. They had their own period of rise and ascendancy, and then eventually their fall. We also looked at the Reset War, which occurred after that civilization that preceded ours fell, and the Reset War was a conflict that was designed to destroy the remaining enclaves of the previous civilization. When we look at the Tartaria or 4th era civilization's timeline, we see that it had 3 distinct phases: a rise, an ascendancy, and a decline. That decline came with a large battle that they had lost, or a significant conflict. We believe that that conflict was against the same adversary that they had faced earlier in their civilization and had defeated. In this exploration, we're looking and positing that all these monuments were in recognition of this adversary they defeated. And who was this adversary? Well, we've looked at it before when we did the exploration on ancient evil. We have serpents that are represented in many of these monuments. We have serpents that are represented as a force of evil. And we certainly have the subculture of snakes or serpents representing evil. Now, do I want to be against snakes and say that you need to kill a snake if you come across it? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. We're merely considering the symbolism here. But we have symbolism from many different aspects that show that for whatever reason, the serpent represented the adversary that the previous civilization faced. Also, think on the nature that we're told of the serpent. The ability to deceive, the ability to change people from the inside and corrupt them. That seems to be what the serpent represented. So whoever this adversary was that Tartaria faced, they certainly had all kinds of unique abilities to change people from the inside out, and perhaps they even had the ability to change the shapes of their own physical forms. We just don't know. We still see aspects of the serpent that endure to this day in various belief systems across the land. We also look at how the representation of the serpent factors into many of our fantasy stories that we're told have no basis in fact and absolutely have no historical foundation. Yet we can't ignore the fact that the aspect of the serpent is constantly depicted and used in many different stories, from Conan the Barbarian to the revived He-Man series, which interestingly enough was quickly canceled once they decided to depict a race of serpents that they fought, and even Snake Mountain becoming a giant serpent god. Now that could all just be a coincidence, but I find it very fascinating that a popular cartoon that was used for marketing was suddenly no longer popular and pulled off the air very quickly. Again, it could just be a coincidence. There are depictions of serpents and what they represent in all cultures from all times, from our contemporary era. We view the serpent with a sense of trepidation. And of course, there are many people who seem to have a natural, almost instinctive fear of serpents or snakes. Yet not all the time is the depiction or use of serpents negative. In the alternative, there seems to be a very positive depiction of serpents that can be seen with different societies, that they represented power and the ability to achieve power. However, looking at most of the representations, they seem to show a very powerful and capable adversary that had to be overcome. We look here at these reliefs in Riga and Latvia, and we see some very serpent-like qualities in this dragon creature. And indeed, dragons were also referred to as serpents or great worms. Many of these figures here in the same city, showing what appears to be some sort of serpent adornment. Is it possible that these were compromised human beings from the previous civilization? Were they changed in some sort of fundamental way, and this created a different segment within the previous Tartarian civilization that fought against it? Perhaps this was the enemy that they had to fight and overcome, and this was the great victory that they won. Until, as we suspect, the adversary changed their tactics and tended to be much more successful as they did so. It's hard to say, but at the same time, you can find this symbolism all over the land, from many different cultures, or at least so we're told. But do we really see these as different cultures? Or are all these symbols, or all these pictures, all these reliefs, very, very similar in how they're depicted? And what are the odds that all these symbols, all these reliefs, and all these depictions would look exactly the same across timelines and across many different civilizations? Because you can see that in many different civilizations they represented the serpent as some sort of divine being. Of course, the question always comes down to, was this a positive or a negative depiction? And to be frank, you can see both. The reliefs in Riga also show something else, a power of a lion, the power of the sun. There are many different symbols, and we will be exploring Riga in due time. It's quite an interesting location. But for right now, we're just taking a look at what we see. And in the symbols, it's almost as though we see a little bit of a conflict being represented. A conflict of almost two segments of humanity, or perhaps an uncorrupted segment of humanity against a corrupted segment of humanity. It's really hard to say. Yet we see some of the familiar symbols that we've seen in other explorations that we've done. We always see the lion, and the lion's always in a position of power. We've also seen this helmet before, and this helmeted figure, and it's in the most unlikely of places on a building that we're told was Art Deco in New York State. And yet even more interesting figures that could perhaps depict something that was far more advanced. Is this a being? Is this just an artistic representation? What exactly is this relief truly of? There's no shortage that we have, though, of triumph figures, or figures that are depicted on arches of triumph. And usually you'll have the same consistent images or statues. We have a horse, we have what typically tends to be a woman, wearing a wreath or a laurel around the head. Sometimes we even have angelic wings. What exactly is this supposed to represent? And why exactly do we see this symbol depicted so frequently everywhere that we look? We're always told that the laurel wreath was usually the Roman symbol of victory and oftentimes worn during the so-called Roman triumph. But did the Romans really exist as we think or believe them to have existed? And yet, looking in other forms of symbolism that we have across the land, we can still see the power that was depicted in both eagles and lions. And interestingly enough, we're told that the so-called Roman civilization venerated the eagle, the aquila as they called it, that their legions carried. But what if this was merely a subversion of what really happened? What if the previous civilization did use eagles and lions, in addition to the often seen griffin, to represent an animal of power, to represent their unified strength when they engaged this terrifying adversary? We even have depictions such as Perseus decapitating Medusa and holding the head up high, and this was most certainly not an easy task. We have numerous depictions of lions and eagles fighting and defeating snakes, and in nearly every depiction that you see, it is the lion or the eagle that is victorious. That with the full power of the previous civilization, the adversary stood no chance against it. But we believe that the adversary changed their tactics and subverted the previous civilization, suddenly making the people believe that their great heroes were actually villains, and they began to decay and destroy themselves from the inside out. It might seem like it's not a plausible explanation, yet at the same time, we can see that in our current civilization, division and strife are the very things that seem to be constantly reinforced in every segment of our current society. But looking at all the depictions, we can see that there was a civilization, there was a time where they seemed to be far more unified in purpose. And it was through that unification in purpose that we see in all this symbolism that they were able to achieve a great victory over the adversary that they had faced in the Fourth Era. Other aspects that you consider when you look at many of these reliefs and many of what is represented in these statues is to realize that this was not an easy battle. Oftentimes we see that this was a life or death struggle, and perhaps this represented what the previous civilization truly faced. Now, it's true, these monuments, these statues, these paintings, all these depictions could simply be a coincidence that all these symbols represent different things from different cultures across different times. And once again, you have to ask the question, just how many coincidences are we actually looking at and accepting for the account that we have of history to be exactly accurate and correct? How difficult was this struggle the previous civilization faced? And if it really was the great triumph that we see, and we see many triumph arches all across the land, the arches of triumph, showing the wondrous architectural capabilities, while at the same time reflecting the achievements of that previous civilization. Now, could these remaining monuments have been altered over time with all the so-called renovations that we witness? That the symbols, at least some of the symbols that could be changed, were changed to potentially give us a different perception, or to try to reflect to us that there were many different civilizations that just happened to have a appreciation for one root previous civilization. I find that explanation very difficult to believe. I find it very difficult to believe in the fact that everybody wanted to emulate the great architectural achievements of Rome and Greece, and they kept doing it all the way to the end of the 1800s. How exactly does that make any sense? Or does it make more sense that all of these stunning monuments and architectural achievements that we see, all of these symbols, the reason there is so much recursion in them is because they were produced by that civilization that preceded ours? That these civilizations had their monuments, and they produced their monuments to reflect their great achievement of winning a very difficult conflict. A conflict that required their society to truly be unified. You have to ask yourself these questions. What truly makes sense? And if it doesn't make sense, how exactly do you explain it? You always ask the 5 W's, the who, what, where, when, and why. And after you ask those 5 W's, then you have to ask how. And if it's not easy to answer those questions, and if you notice inconsistencies, then you have to ask more questions, and you have to keep exploring. Because the answer tends to elude us if we just accept whatever simple explanation that we're given, even if it makes no sense whatsoever. Such as this wonderful monument being constructed in 24 minutes, which someone may try to tell us. And do we believe it, or do we question it? It's ultimately up to us how far we want to go with these explorations, and if we're really seeking answers. It's not easy. It's certain to say that the path of least resistance is just to accept exactly what you've been told. To accept that there are legitimate reasons for all of these monuments looking the same, for all this architecture appearing the same, even though in some cases between the cultures that constructed them there's 1,000 years, and what we're told is half a world away of distance. So how exactly does that make any sense when you really consider it? I believe that these monuments that we're looking at, the reason that they're so similar is that they did come from the civilization that preceded ours. As a little bit of a bonus, I wanted to take a closer look at the Cathedral Basilica in St. Louis, Missouri. When we explored the basilica on the ground, I didn't really have the chance to stay inside and really look at all the symbolism that we had within the very impressive cathedral. We can see here at the altar we have what looks to be a smaller dome. Now remember the size and immensity of this building. I also wanted to take a close look at the mosaics or the paintings, because what do they really represent? We're told that this is a very impressive Catholic cathedral basilica in St. Louis. Are these figures supposed to be the wise men, the apostles? There's many unique paintings and drawings and figures that adorn the domes, the walls, the arches, all the impressive structural achievements of this unbelievable edifice. Here, looking up in the dome, we see what appears to be angelic figures. We also have what we would expect to be the representation of Jesus, and yet at the same time we see other figures on the inside of the dome and under the dome. What exactly is this supposed to represent? Some aspect of the Holy Spirit within the individual? The more you look, it seems as though you get more questions, because these are very interesting depictions. Is this something from Ben-Hur, even though this cathedral basilica was constructed well before that film came out? At least so we're told, although I suspect it was constructed very long before Ben-Hur ever came out. Looking here over at this particular dome, they seem to represent more modern aspects within this painting. Yet we see many structures that are depicted on the wall as well. Is that showing some sort of development? Or is that chronicling something that came in a civilization before us? Because you look and you see some of the structures that are depicted in the painting. And what exactly do these symbols represent? And I'm sure there'll be many who will tell me that these are simple Catholic representations and that they represent the ultimate form of piety in Catholicism. And that's fine, and I could accept that. But I have to look at these figures, I have to look at these depictions and really ask what exactly is being depicted. Is this really showing us what we're told? Well, here it may, and I do suspect that there are tenets of our major religions in our current civilization that do have their origin in our very distant past. So, could we have constructed parts of it, changed it, decorated it? Yes. But are there portions of it that have been there a very long time? Will pour out my spirit on all flesh. I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. What exactly is this representing? And what does it truly mean? Both the saying and the depiction. Now, I have some familiarity with Catholicism, but that just defies what I'm aware of. Maybe somebody out there can help me in the comments. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to complete our last exploration on Tartaria as a whole. In the past, we've looked at the greater glories of Tartaria. We've explored what it may have looked like, and these are just theories because the reality is we have no idea exactly what it looked like. But we have a good idea of what it may have looked like based on the remaining architectural examples that we have that endured to our own civilization in the 5th era. And yet, for whatever reason, the civilization of the 4th era, what we call Tartaria on this channel, is a civilization that we find very alluring. We also find that many of the greatest achievements in humanity and its history seem to be reflected in Tartaria, and the actual intention behind this civilization, which was to achieve balance within the individual, but also to achieve balance between the individual, the cities, and nature. It's certainly something that we can see in our current civilization that we tend not to have balance. At least not a balance that we can recognize. We oftentimes see ourselves being moved to polar opposites on any and every issue, whether it's the differences in our ideology or our appearances or even our economic systems. And as a result of our deference to this type of conflict, we see our civilization in ruins. We see the ruins of the previous civilization of Tartaria. We know that it was a great civilization that had achieved wondrous heights, a unity of purpose within humanity. But how exactly did it fall? In the past, we posited who was truly responsible, and we came to a little bit of a conclusion that perhaps we were responsible, or at least our progenitors were responsible. Yet, looking deeper into the history of Tartaria, I think we can still see the very forces and their effects in our current civilization that caused the fall of the previous civilization. If you think about what every civilization aspires to be and do, it's to grow and to increase in size and knowledge. And while the people of Tartaria looked within themselves, they sought more lands to explore. There are accounts in this that they opened portals to other lands, that they attempted to access areas that they didn't have access to. In effect, they had reached the physical boundaries of their realm or their lands, and they sought to explore others. It was in this exploration, though, that they opened a portal to a dark land, and they allowed some other dark beings to reach their land through this portal. By the time that they had realized what they had opened up, they found themselves facing an entity with a power that they couldn't even begin to imagine. An entity that seemed to reflect some sort of anti-deity, or an anti-god, if you will. This anti-god quickly filled the land and turned the people of Tartaria against themselves. But how was this achieved? What happened that caused the great civilization that was unified in purpose, that had achieved balance, to completely fall apart and ultimately be destroyed? We can still see the remnants of Tartaria everywhere we look across the lands. Castles, ruins, some buildings that are kept in better shape than others, and even older remnants of the buildings of previous eras. When we look at our 5 eras theory, we start with our contemporary era because that's where we are now. And we examine all of the aspects of our contemporary era. People will tell you that some things don't apply to Tartaria and some things do, but the reality is everything does. Because we are descended. We are the progeny of the civilizations that came before us. It doesn't matter if there were 4 resets, 5 resets, or 2,000 resets. We are still the same people. It's safe to say that there have been vast changes within both ourselves and our civilization and the society. When we look at the 4th era, the Tartarian civilization, we examine their great triumph. But now we're going to look at the decline and fall. How did this great civilization erode and disintegrate, ultimately turn upon itself, and then found itself isolated and destroyed by the forces that it had exposed itself to in its attempts to explore new lands, to access other lands? And we can see the great tragedy of the destruction of the once great examples of architecture. And we can see the remnants of it, even perhaps in some of the images that we have that perhaps were not altered from the 19th century. The height of the 4th era, or the Tartarian civilization, is something that we believe dreams are composed of. It's very difficult to properly imagine or visualize exactly what these images were in this civilization. The finest examples of architecture and society working together, people achieving balance, looking inward for internal strength, and most importantly, possessing self-discipline. What we know as our paradigm in our current civilization is that we have external discipline. In other words, external institutions, individuals enforce discipline upon us. We do not seek to be self-disciplined. We tend to be discouraged from seeking self-discipline. And what this leads to is when you rely on another force, authority, or individual to impose discipline upon you, it means that that entity is ultimately dictating how you're going to live your life. They're going to tell you what's important, and they're going to do it in the most insidious ways possible. Even though you may be consciously aware of it, even though you may see it, and you write about it and you lament about it every day of your life, you're oftentimes willing to accept it because you've been conditioned to accept it. You've been conditioned that there can be nothing better in the past, or that in the past everything just fell apart because the previous civilization was corrupt. And indeed, a lot of what we're allowed to or encouraged to explore when it comes to a previous civilization was the ways in which it was corrupt. Because you'll see that the corruption is reflected in our current civilization, and even in our supposed recorded mainstream account, you will find the examples of corruption. Yet contrast that with what we see as the dream of Tartaria, or the Fourth Era civilization. And that dream is a people who had self-discipline, who had self-restraint, and yet at the same time achieved balance. They were able to overcome their physical differences and all the other differences and live in a state of balance. Now, of course, this has to be mocked, this has to be derided, because this is a threat to the current power structure that we have in our Fifth Era civilization. No one is supposed to know that they have greater capabilities as an individual, that they have spiritual strength which cannot be matched in any way, shape, or form. Yet looking at the examples that we have of the Fourth Civilization, with the great achievements in architecture, we'll be told that somebody else had to do this. It was a divine being, or it was some form of artificial intelligence, which nowadays seems to be a substitute for a divine being for many. And if that's what you choose to believe, then so be it. But we have to remember that many of the greatest works of art that depict the wonders of the past came from a human being. It came from a human's creative inspiration. The tales of fantasy did not come from some artificial intelligence. They came from human creativity, the spirituality within every single human being that no doubt comes from some sort of divine power. And while I may not have spoken of it directly in the past in the channel, I've certainly alluded to it. And the reality is, our search for understanding and who we are comes from within. It does not come without. And ultimately, that was the great mistake. That was the mistake that was made in the past that led to the eventual destruction and downfall of Tartaria. When you look at all the myths and all the examples of what may have been in the past, even that does not match the grandeur for what was in reality. Because we can look across the lands and we can see great examples of horrific destruction in Siberia, in the northeastern portion of Siberia. And we'll have a designated historical account that'll tell us what was there, and will tell us about the great kingdoms that were there. But I don't believe that at the height of its civilization that a person, a citizen of Tartaria, the civilization, or whatever it was actually called, because remember that we just use that name as a placeholder because we don't know what language they spoke. We don't know what exactly they called their civilization or how they divided their lands, and perhaps they didn't divide their lands at all. They didn't believe in such a concept. It's always interesting when you look at the concepts of certain cultures that we're told believed in boundaries on land, but then conversely we're told that they did not believe in the boundaries of land, that land had now boundaries, that land was for everyone. Now you might be arguing, well, how could anybody live in such a system where there's no division? Well, somehow we manage to live in cities now where there's no actual division, although we believe there's a division of ownership. Is it real, or is it just what we accept? These are all questions that we have to explore. We also look at the concept of Camelot and King Arthur and the legend of Excalibur. I believe that that particular myth alludes to what was very likely the last legitimate regime of Tartaria, or the civilization that preceded ours. It was not based upon one person's vanity, or one person acting as king. Yes, there was King Arthur, but King Arthur didn't see himself as some sort of divine monarch. What he ultimately saw himself as was a person who worked for the betterment of the entire civilization. That was indeed the very crux of the idea of the Round Table. That everyone was equal, no one was above any other, and that the role of being the leader was simply a function. It was not some sort of near divine being that was to be worshipped. Ultimately, Arthur sacrificed himself for what was and the dream of what could be. And it's those very words that we have to remember. Things were once very great in the past, and they could be very great in the future. The way things were subverted was by kings and titles. Once the entity that managed to infiltrate Tartarian civilization, or the Fourth Era civilization, grabbed hold, one of the first things it seemed to do was to subvert individuals. And where that started was many individuals taking the title of king. How much do we value the title of king? How much do you see the use of king this and king that? King Charles, King Henry, King Charles the Simple, King Charlemagne. It goes on and on. Although Charlemagne had himself declared emperor, it doesn't really matter because what you have is this obsession almost with titles. Now, before anybody says that I'm degrading anybody who puts value in titles, that's not what I'm saying at all. But what I'm saying is that when you embrace the importance of titles, you have to be cautious because before you know it, you are suddenly putting the certification of a larger group on your own self-value. In other words, the titles that endure to this day. I remember there was a political science teacher during his class who was explaining to his students that we don't use titles in the United States anymore. For example, you would call me Lord Schmidt if we still use titles. And then one of the students quite accurately quipped, yes, but we still have to call you Dr. Schmidt. Everybody got a good chuckle out of that, including myself. But what it says, though, is that if you value titles over your own individual value, then you're letting someone else dictate what your value is. And that is not what life is about. We dictate our own value. And no matter how many people try to tell you fallacies, how many people try to convince you that they're doing the right thing, or whoever dresses up in kingly robes with their wonderful adornments and decorations, there really is no difference between one human being or another. And one of the other things that caused the Fourth Era civilization to fall apart was not just the embracing of titles and indulgence in self-vanity. It was also the change in identity. What we saw was suddenly a more increased political division, a geographical division within the lands, dividing up the lands into many different principalities, and suddenly changing the ways in which they were facilitated, and even embracing the concept of being governed. If you have a people who are self-disciplined, what need is there for governance? But if you have a people who are not self-disciplined and have to be disciplined by an external force, then you have every great need for governance, which involves individuals taking the titles of king and dressing up in all the pageantry that you can imagine, with flowing robes and very nice tights. And we have room for queens too, or it doesn't really matter. Anybody can call themselves a king. It doesn't matter what your gender or your background is, or it's interesting how it even transcends cultures, that pretty much anybody can be declared a king for any point in time, or an emperor. And indeed, many of the symbols of this endure to this day. So what you have that's been effectively undermined, and what was no doubt effectively undermined in the Fourth Era civilization, was the concept of leadership. Instead of a leader seeing themselves as a servant of the people, they looked to themselves as divine beings. The defense forces of Tartaria were subverted as well. Now, I've long had an exploration looking into the military orders that we have of the medieval period, and not just focused on Europe, but all the other military orders across the lands. Yet, we can see a great example in the military orders that we believe are associated with Europe, even though they operated extensively in what is today the Middle East, such as the Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights Hospitaller, all the other military orders that we have. The one that tends to get the most attention, though, is the Knights Templar. What we're told about the Knights Templar in our official history is that they were a military order that was founded for the Crusades, for the European or the Latin nations, as they were called at that time, to recapture the Holy Land for Christendom. And in their foundation, though, we seem to have views of chastity, views of poverty, and that they were specifically dedicated to their mission. But the Knights Templar, unfortunately, according to the official account, decided to embrace the concept of wealth, and that they were, in effect, one of the early banking systems, at least according to the official history, that presided over Europe, and as a result of which they were targeted and destroyed by the monarch of France, again according to the official history. And yet, if we look at how they operated, the Knights Templar, if they had stayed true to their original vows, what was closer? What was closer to the original concept of the once great military that defended Tartaria or the Fourth Era civilization? I believe it was the original vows and concepts of chivalry. And I've noticed that when you study this, when you study the official historical account of medieval history, you'll be told that knights only applied chivalry to noble ladies and nobility. They didn't apply it to anybody else. But what if it did apply to everyone? What if the reality was the concept of chivalry, the concept of humility, of actually embracing and defending others, did universally apply to everyone? How much does that change these military orders in our eyes, if that's what they were truly about? And over time they became subverted. Much in the same way that the leaders of Tartaria were subverted, these knights became subverted and suddenly began to embrace the importance of material possessions, and not just money, but even the idea of money. Strangely enough, the very same things that we contend with every day. Now, I'm not saying that the concept of material possessions in and of themselves are bad. Like everything else, it's how we deal with things. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by anything, whether it's material possessions, love, or anything, it can cause us to do things that we would not do otherwise. Because suddenly we start to value the idea of this over our own self-discipline. We lose our self-identity. And if you look at the things that we contend with every day, it seems as though everything is directed towards keeping us from understanding our true selves. And this is very true when we look at the official historical account of the Knights Templar. This is a military order that had a very noble purpose and seemed to have a very noble method, a methodology behind how they lived true to that noble purpose and those values. Indeed, the Knights Templars are viciously derided as evil, or the antagonists, in the novel Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. You might remember we looked at the Scott Monument when we did our exploration in Scotland. It's a very striking monument that supposedly depicts characters. This is the original depiction of the Knights Templar. Two knights riding one horse, and the reason being because they were impoverished. That was one of their essential vows. Very similar to the Franciscan monastic order in Christianity, that they embraced poverty. And yet there is a conflicting account that says that these Knights Templar devolved into concepts of violence, and they believed in violence and engaging in acts of violence, and that became more important to them, in addition to their valuing the idea of money above all else. And you can find a similar account with the Teutonic Knights, who supposedly took in the remnants of the Knights Templar and then continued their so-called colonization efforts into what is today Prussia. It's very interesting, and this is all the official historical account. Yet, again, there are conflicting accounts that say that these military orders once had a more noble purpose, that knights truly did live true to the concept of chivalry, and that it didn't just apply to a select few in the population, but it applied equally to everyone. So what's reality and what's merely the blended fiction? It's hard to say. And that's all by design. We're not supposed to have a clear account of the civilization that preceded us. Indeed, you're encouraged, and it's quite okay to talk about the Knights Templar once they had devolved. There's an interesting episode of Robin of Sherwood, yes, that show again, that I think tells the entire story of the Knights Templar in one single episode. It's called 7 Poor Knights from Acre. And in that story, Robin Hood and his band of outlaws come across a group of Knights Templar, 7 knights, who had a small object, a gold object that was a depiction of the Order of the Knights Templar stolen from them by this individual. As a result of this, the Knights Templar seek to find the individual responsible, kill him, and then reacquire their material item that supposedly means everything to their honor. And in the process of doing so, they kill many innocent people trying to retrieve this object, and they even kill a member of Robin's band. And Robin himself has to actually engage in hand-to-hand combat, single combat with one of the knights to try to save one of the other members of his band. It's a very well-written story, and it's very interesting how within an hour they managed to summarize the exact progress of the Knights Templar. How they went from being a monastic order that was dedicated to the defense of a society to an order that was self-serving. Supposedly it was about their honor, but the reality is it was about the material item that had monetary value. That's why they went on this little quest near Nottingham, and why they killed innocent people, and why they attempted to terrorize Robin Hood and the outlaws. They even ran afoul of the sheriff and Guy of Gisborne, although the sheriff, acting on his own opportunistic notions, tells Guy to stand down and allow the Knights Templar to hunt Robin and the band of outlaws. Because why do it when they could have someone else do it for them? In the end, Robin Hood prevails, and I didn't understand it at first, but I do now. The knights are stripped of the armor, and then they're sent off on one horse. And you can see that the 2 knights here, without their armor, do actually reflect what's supposed to be the ideal concept for the Knights Templar. 2 knights riding on one horse. I'd missed that when I initially viewed the episode, but upon rewatch for this exploration, I saw the truth in that. And that's what it reflects. It doesn't just reflect that truth for military orders, leaders, or monastic orders. Consider that Tartaria was carved into successor states, ruled by kings. And these are the aspects of Tartaria we're supposed to talk about. And you'll find 3 greater Tartaries or Tartarias all over the map in many different locations. We also have the accounts of madness that gripped the previous civilization. And there's no doubt that there were some people who tried to live true to the values of self-discipline, and they ran afoul of the compromised leaders and military orders, some of which who still acted in accordance with the rules of the old civilization, and others that didn't. And this is likely why we have these accounts of all these strange sicknesses, such as the dancing plague and many other bizarre accounts from our supposed incorruptible mainstream historical account. But I do think there's a lot of truth to this. There is a lot of truth into the history that we are able to see. But what seems to be the consistent reality is that we're only supposed to see the previous civilization as being a failure. We're supposed to question ourselves, and we're supposed to feel helpless, and the last thing we're ever supposed to develop is a sense of self-discipline, a sense of the ability of exploring ourselves and finding our own spiritual strength from within. You need to rely on other institutions. You need to have other people tell you what to do. When you look at how the lands were carved up and divided politically, you notice that as maps become newer, these political boundaries become more prevalent. They're a lot easier to see. Why is that? Why is it on older maps it seems as though there are no true political boundaries? Why do these accounts of mass insanity and hysteria seem to increase in certain times? What makes more sense? Was there really just all these isolated incidences of mass panic going on? Or was it really a population that was trying to struggle to find itself, to understand why their entire civilization was collapsing, why the leaders that they had trusted had suddenly turned against them, and were constantly keeping them turned against one another? Why was the great defense force that they had once relied on suddenly turning to materialism and not living true to the values that they always had? It had to be a very frightening experience for them, and no doubt many did try to find their way back to their own self-internal images, and yet at the same time, they found the people that they had relied on turning against them. And it's safe to say that this mentality, this primary method of operation, continues to this day. It is very easy to keep people turned against one another, and you can find any variety of reasons to turn people against one another. And I have no doubt that even in the grand heritage of the previous civilization, that some groups were told that they were more responsible for the achievements than other groups. It's another way. It's more of a positive way that you can turn people against one another. You can say that some people are more responsible for others for achievements than others. You can then say that those people who are not more responsible are the outcasts from society. There are people who shouldn't be listened to. You can use any number of means to reinforce this. You can use financial incentives, you can use patronage, and you'll see it every day. And no doubt this has been with us longer than we can begin to imagine. That is how the previous civilization ultimately collapsed. How it broke down into successor states, corrupted by the very forces of evil, corrupted from the inside and the outside, disintegrating and eroding, until finally it became vulnerable. Vulnerable by the very forces that it had unfortunately encountered. In its exploration for more land to explore, they had unleashed a great evil. An evil that destroyed them from the inside. And there's no doubt that there are concepts of this evil that remain with us to this day. And you don't have to look very far or very hard to see examples of it. Can it be overcome? Well, the reality is, it's still unchanged from when King Arthur said it. Defend what was and the dream of what could be. There is still a very powerful dream of what could be. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed this exploration of the 5 eras. Please like, comment, and subscribe. So, the time paradox, the recorder paradox, and historical revision. A lot of what guides this channel revolves around these 3 concepts. And what are these 3 concepts? Well, we'll start with the time paradox. Now, if you've been watching the channel, it was over a year ago that we released the exploration, the date paradox, or the time paradox. What year is it? Because you'll see it's clearly shown here on the thumbnail. It was 2023 when this was released. Is it really 2023? Is it currently 2024? The answer is, I don't know. I mean, do you know what year it is? I mean, are you confident in what year it is? How many different dating systems do we have? And how many different ways have we counted years over time? And why is that pertinent and relevant to what we do, especially with our historical explorations? And honestly, I'm asking right now, does anybody know what year it is? Anybody want to venture a guess? Are you confident that it's 2024? I mean, there's all kinds of historical conflicts on that one. Hey, Tracy, good to see you. Exactly, and it's one of those things that we tend to take for granted, and it's anybody and everybody. And one of the other questions that I'll run by you, and this is a good point here, Fairy Girl, we're definitely in a different year than the mainstream tells us. Can't say with impunity. Absolutely. But how many people embrace the fact that we can say with impunity? I had a feeling I was going to see 10 something. You know, I'm glad you bring that up, though. You know, whether you're venturing guesses there. Yeah, good one there, Brother Adam Bum. The 2112 Overture. Yeah, that's one of my favorite Rush songs, too. Hey, Chris, good to see you. But it's intriguing that it tends to be a 4-digit year, even though the mainstream loves to tell us how many years that we have. And so understanding and being aware of the fact that we really don't know what year it is critical to our understanding, because it's really the basic confidence trick. And if you think about it, who here in the entire land right now was alive to witness firsthand what we think of as the year 1899? Ah, yes, the secrets of forever time. And time functions just like distance. You can always impose more time and more distance when you need to explain something. So, great point on that one, Tracy. But there's more to it behind that, because time factors in with the when we look at the 5 W's behind anything and everything. And remember, we always look at the who, what, where, when, why. And then we ask the how. Although oftentimes the 5 W's are mixed up to confuse the how. What are the major indicators of truth? Well, here we have these images of city destruction, but yet I've imposed what the historical mainstream tells us happened with each of these photos. I mean, are they true? Or is it just a caption that went with them? Was the city destroyed by fire? Was this city destroyed by a random explosion? Was this city destroyed by the March of Sherman? So obviously it must be Atlanta, although there were many other cities in Georgia that were destroyed by Sherman, according to the mainstream account. And what about immigration? It all factors in, though. If we don't know what year it is, then how do we know exactly when these events occur? We have an idea, but how confident are we? And remember that question, was there anybody alive from 1899 who can tell us they witnessed these events firsthand? And of course, we focus on the 1800s because that's really the mystery century, as it were. But the 1900s is even more mysterious, especially the early 1900s, oddly enough. And yet we have people that lived through that. I always appreciate those comments where people tell me, well, my grandfather, my great-grandfather was alive during that time, so those events must have happened. Funny. I mean, I talked to my grandfather a lot, and he did live through the early to mid 1900s, and he could never tell me about any buildings or anything like that. But take it for what it is. Thanks, Albie. I appreciate that. I don't even know what day it is most of the time. Yeah, that's kind of how it goes for me too, Chassis. Hey, my bailiwick zone. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Oh, there's a good one, Kathy. And a minor disparity right there. I mean, that's only 10 years difference, but you're right. There's different calendars. There's different dating systems. Ask somebody from China what year it is. Ask somebody from Israel what year it is. There's many different calendars and dating systems. And how many are we aware of? How many do we actively use? And then when you really want to throw confusion into this, imagine the fact that in the distant past, they were looking at different forms of dating. In other words, a season, or what we think of as a season, counted as a year. In some cultures, a month counted as a year. And then you have others with long count calendars, such as the Mayans. Now, did they really count a year the same way we did? We're assured that they did, but how do we know for certain? And now the recorder issue. So we talk about the time paradox, we understand the ambiguity of time, and now we go to the recorder paradox. So we have these professional historians, all these university omniscient know-it-alls, like unfortunately yours truly once used to be and now denies that, but the recorder paradox. So who's actually recording the events of history? Do historians record the events of history? These ruined cities always look like they've gone through a blitzkrieg. Yeah, blitzkrieg, carpet bombing, total saturation bombing. Yes, I use saturation loosely, but yes, it does look like there's all sorts of destruction. Does anybody know what film this image is from? And of course, I chose it very consciously. That's a good point there, Esma. Yes, January, February didn't originally exist. There were other months that were added too. The winners, yes, that's a good saying there, Peter. But, then you could ask the question, who are the winners? Yeah, the victor. The victors do. But was there really ever any conflict? At least conflict that we know of. I mean, what do we think of current conflicts? Do we have different victors? There you go. Yes, Marine. Yes, Doc Shelley. It's 1984. Do you know about the Chronovision? Well, let's come back to that, Albie. Let's come back to that. So, on 1984, this is actor John Hurt portraying the protagonist, Winston. Very fitting name. Especially if you've looked at the recent, and I do keep up on the news headlines, although I'll admit I don't read too deep in the news. But anyways, you remember his job, Winston, the character in 1984, he was part of the Ministry of Truth. And what he did was he went through news articles and edited them to conform to the current nature of events. So what you had was a constant process of revision on all historical documents and all news, and that was his job. And remember that Winston was a member of the outer party. So really what we would think of in our society as the middle class. And channel members might recall our little author that we looked at a couple weeks ago who was going after the middle class, saying that they're the cause of all problems and they stole the American dream. Yes, very interesting novel. But in this particular story, whether you're talking 1984, the book, or any one of the numerous film versions, and they're all pretty good. I got to admit, though, the one they put out in 1984 was very, very fittingly dystopian. But he would edit the news. He would edit history. He would change pictures. He would change articles. He would change names. He would change affiliations and reported events. And this was in a constant process of revision. Or you could even say it's an ideological revolution that's occurring with every article he alters. Now, am I suggesting that there is a real life Winston that's out there that's changing documents and news? No, you don't need to see it. You don't need that. This is an extreme example, but the idea of it is important. It's important to understand that perhaps our history, our understanding of the past, is a lot more malleable than we're led to believe. What are your thoughts on that? The AI has revised history. Yes, in some ways it has, and even references to the AI. He didn't die, but it was strongly implied he would die. Not to spoil it, but I guess you could say in a way he did die because, oh boy, did he really give in to what happened to him. Hey, Sky Sage, good to see you. Yes, like a fact checker and a wiki editor. Great example. Not quite to these same extremes, but we were informed that we have different news sources. We're informed that we have different nations with different purposes, different intentions, and so on and so forth. But do we? It's... Oh, there you go. Yes. Great comment there, Robert. History is like a living document. I would even go so far as to say history is a living document. It's constantly being changed. And the reason I bring up the whole concept of who's actually recording history, the historians do not record history in the moment, do they? Whether it's a person who's an actual recorder, the job of recorder, or typically government official, whatever government official is recording history. And you might recall, hey Chadwick, good to see you. You might recall that in one of our earlier explorations in one of the Iowa counties, they admitted that the official county records were kept by a judge in a shoebox. So yes, your shoebox documents. It makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Indeed. Whose story? Well, I guess it depends who's telling it in the moment, right, Jamie? Quantum eraser, changing the past to change the future. Yeah, in a lot of respects, that's exactly what's happening. Hey, PJC West, good to see you as well. So moving on, I thought I would introduce this idea of historical revisionism, critical re-examination of historical facts with or without new evidence. Now, the concept of historical revisionism was argued quite extensively when I was still with the university. Because guess what? There's been a lot more historical revisionism, especially since the 2000s. And I don't think that's a controversial comment to make, because it seems to have accelerated. Now, is that to say it didn't happen in the 1900s? No, it happened in the 1900s. I guess you could say the process just seems to have been refined. And in a very insidious way, because it always seems like everyone's always acting in the nature of doing what is for the greater good, but then you have to ask the greater good of who. By the way, why can you do historical revision without new evidence? What would be a reason? What's an example of someone doing historical revision without new evidence? Good question. More on that later. Keep that thought in mind, though, because we're definitely going to look at it. Watch it in real time with the American media. Yeah. And now they've got the process down to where they can change it every day or every hour. Reverse course. Oh, we got something else to tell you. Reverse course. Saw the Catacomb of Paris and the Last Supper woke parody in the Paris Olympic ceremony. Isn't that weird? Yeah, I'm going to come back and take a look at that. There's weird stuff going on, although I'm under the mindset now that they're just throwing that into every opening Olympic ceremony because, they've got to obfuscate what they've already shown in the past. So. Hey, Polly, good to see you. Thanks for joining us. Ah, yes. Great way to say it, too, Esma. Social issues. And oddly enough, that's been going on since the 1900s, and it's very easy to document that, or at least have a hint that that's what's going on, that they're constantly revising history in the name of social issues. Hey, Tara, good to see you. Aloha. Well, and good point on Wikipedia. Think about that, because prior to the advent of Wikipedia, everybody relied on their encyclopedias. Now, whether that was Encyclopedia Britannica or one of the Time Life series or whatever, you had your fixed books there, and that's what you would refer to, and that's what you'd go off of. But now you have a true living document. Referencing what Robert said earlier, you've got an online document that can very easily and subtly be changed. Hey, Sovereign, Invisible, and Traceable, thanks for joining us. Yes. And it really was like opening the tunnel. So, I have not seen the film one by one. I'll have to check it out, Jamie. Don't let me forget about that, so. But back on the concept of historical revisionism, it is an official policy within history departments. It is accepted that historical revision needs to happen. Now, how legitimate is it? Well, that's what we're going to discuss. Because some people believe that historical revisionism is the reinterpretation of a historical account or narrative based on actual facts and authenticated evidence. That's what we used to be told. So you had to have new facts and new evidence. You couldn't just change a historical account. But now you have what they call historical distortion, when historical accounts or narratives are changed to suit a quote unquote personal agenda. Yeah, sure, it's a personal agenda. It involves disinformation and lies to change history. So, does it really seem like someone is concerned about maintaining an objective historical account, or can someone really change a historical account to suit whatever point they want to make? Or maybe they have a purpose behind it. Maybe there's a reason to keep everyone confused, because what do we like to say when people are confused? They tend to defer to what more when they're confused? I think if you've been on the channel, you've heard me say this a few times. Yeah, wouldn't it be nice if we could just get the truth? You know, I'm all about it too. But everybody's got to machine gun you for trying to get the truth or just the facts. I mean, what are the facts? Facts are what I say they are, and that's what a lot of people will tell you. They won't say it like that, but they'll come across with that kind of confidence. And that's one of the hardest things to look for. Exactly. Response is, you're crazy usually. Why are you even questioning it? And it's a good point, Bad Wolf, and that's what a lot of people will say. Yes, especially if you go off of the Thomas Hobbes mentality of it, because the book Leviathan, which I strongly recommend anybody who's looking to understand how governments operate in the fifth era or our current era, just read Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes lays it out, and he says it very clearly what governments are really all about. It's no conspiracy. They need to have that control. Anarchy is bad. It's really bad. Yes, indeed. So it's important to understand, though, the difference of these ideas, because historical revisionism is something that's embraced and used by the mainstream, but then they still keep the idea open of historical distortion. So really, authority. Authority decides what's legitimate revision and what's distortion. Now, they do give you an idea of what are some of the impacts of revisionism on society. It erases marginalized voices. Oh, that's true. Distorts the truth. Absolutely true. Undermines democracy. Well, we know what country this one came from. You know, the country that loves to talk about democracy but hates to practice it. Oh, did I just say that out loud? Yeah, I did. And promotes intolerance. So, oddly enough, in this little diagram, we do see a lot of truth of the impact of revisionism or distortion or whatever you want to call it today on society. It does erase marginalized voices. It does distort the truth. It does promote intolerance, and it'll undermine any sort of confidence in government, whether you have a republic, a democracy, or I've been waiting for this one, a pseudo-republic or pseudo-democracy. Anyways. The Department of Bamboozlery. Yeah, that's probably a good way to put it too, Jamie. So, absolutely right, Sky Sage. It becomes very, very hard to decipher when truth is mixed with lies. And then even more insidiously, when you have verifiable truth that's mixed with lies, people can confirm that truth. And then they start to believe the lies because they confirm the truth. For example, I don't know, just shoving a foundation stone in a building that somebody clearly established a year, saying the building was built in 1887, although anybody with eyes can see it was added later. Yes, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, no doubt about it. Pride and ego distorts people's abilities. They have been lied to. I'm sorry. Pride and ego distorts people's ability to accept they have been lied to. Absolutely right, Brother Adam. And it's not just pride and ego that plays a huge part in it, but it's also the desire to conform, because the first thing we're socialized with is to concern ourselves with what other people care about concerning our activities. Ah, yes, founded. Good one there, Brian. The general public not questioning history is a problem too big to overcome, it feels like, unfortunately. Well, it depends on your perspective. You know, I mean, are we looking at society, or are we looking at what we can do as individuals or a small group of individuals? Awareness does go a long way. Now, you know, we looking to fix society all in one stroke? No, that's not realistic, but we can definitely understand where we are as individuals, and then we can make a difference in our own lives. Hey, RB, good to see you. Conform, confirm, you know, and so many different C words that get bandied about quite a bit. Ah, yes. Groupthink is very dirty. And I agree with that. And guess what? Groupthink can happen in anything. It can happen in any institution. It can even happen with a group of alternative researchers. Yes, I said it. You have to be careful. You have to be careful not to succumb to groupthink. The reality is, between 6 alternative researchers, they might have elements of the truth. But if you tend to revolve around one for whatever reason, or you think one's more influential, then suddenly, yes, it becomes, as Kathy says here, a hive mind, or as Sky Sage says, a mob mentality. So I think it's very important that it's a fine line. I like to say it's a balance. I know it's a bit of a cliche, but that's the reality behind it. You balance your individual research or your individual inclinations with the with the necessary requirements of any group or society. But oddly enough, if you read Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, there is no balance. The government is everything. You will give your life to the government because you agreed to accept that government, whether they conquered you or you voted for it, that's completely immaterial. And that's life, according to Thomas Hobbes anyway. So I still think Road Warrior is better than Thunderdome, so there. You know what? Yes, although I'll admit, I did like the fact that Thunderdome finished a story. I don't know what the heck Fury Road is trying to do, and now we got a prequel to a sequel. And don't worry, we'll get a sequel to a sequel that was a prequel. Gotta love modern movies, another good sign of the time. So there's a good comment. Accepting the responsibility that goes along with knowing for faith without works is dead. Once you know you're responsible to do what is right. Absolutely. And a great way to say it, too. Worse yet is the apathy. So many just don't care to know the truth. Well, if you've ever watched the TV show Sons of Anarchy, and no, I'm not broadcasting it, there's a great saying that comes from the main character's father when he's reading his journal. And he talks about how people yearn for the idea of freedom, but they don't really want to work for the idea of freedom. To be free requires a lot of hard work. It requires a lot of difficulty in accepting personal responsibility. And a lot of people will forfeit that just for the idea of comfort or the reality of comfort. They'll give up anything just not to make decisions. Well, who knows? I'm not so much the person who likes to say non-player characters or NPCs, which is what that refers to. But it's an interesting way to look at things. I think they have basically an individual spectrum. Yeah, I know that word's been subverted too. Maybe I shouldn't use that. But every person has potential. How about that? And some individuals have more potential or have activated more potential to really understand themselves, to really awaken the individual on the inside, or as I like to say, achieve self-agency. And a lot of others don't, because they like to conform to, as Adam Baum says here, welfare and nanny state of mind. Someone else is going to make decisions. Someone else is going to do it for you. Or as Homer Simpson said in that episode of The Simpsons, Trash of the Titans, can't someone else do it? Well, yeah, there's actually a lot of that mentality. Now, no one will come out and say it, but that's how they act every day. Yes, the very classic example of cognitive dissonance, Sky Sage. Big Daddy Government and Alistair Cooke, if you remember the host of the original Masterpiece Theater way back in the day, he actually did a talk about that. Big Daddy's going to take care of everything. And we're going to do an exploration pretty soon where we actually talk about where that came about and was that part of ending the last reset or what? Hard to say, hard to know. 2020 showed me just how much people do not want real freedom and will love to take others' freedom away. Yeah, that's an unfortunate truth, RB. Although the other thing I'll say is that's always been the way it is. It's just it seemed like it had to be a little bit more wrapped up or a little bit more dressed up in the past. And now, it's no big deal. I have power, so I can enjoy exercising that power over others. All right, moving on. And our good old friend Ken Burns here. And we might recall that Ken Burns, in his Civil War series, he actually gets a lot of grief from historians. And I want to bring that up because he's acknowledged as a filmmaker and entertainer, and a lot of legitimate historians. In fact, you can even find writer Shelby Foote, whether you want to consider him a legitimate historian or not, criticizing Ken Burns about the fact that he believes he changed a lot of the theme of the U.S. Civil War in the eponymous series, The Civil War. And so why do I highlight Ken Burns? Because Ken Burns is someone who does reach a lot of people. His movies are seen by a lot of people. So do they influence the mindset? Is it part of the revision that's constantly occurring? And you could argue yes. I mean, just go back and look at the films about the Civil War, the United States Civil War I'm referring to here, and see how the perception of it changed from 1960 to 1980. I mean, very, very interesting. And oddly enough, look at how many photos suddenly got coughed out to the public when the Civil War in 1990 was released. Nobody had seen a lot of those photos. Of course, there's no combat photos, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means it's not likely it didn't happen as they told us, right? Ah, yes, 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 yes. Well, and every director's done it to some extent, or changed the way to look at it. Boo Ken Burns. That's a good one, Kathy. Were you saying Boo Earns or Boo Ken Burns? I'm not sure. Good reference there. Yeah, reinforcing the narrative is really what it comes down to, or reinforcing what the perception is supposed to be in the day. And believe me, this guy has moved the needle quite a few times without fail. And then here's a great example: how we saw it, how it really happened, how other people saw it. Now, I'm going to break early for our 2-minute break because I really want you to think about this one and really take this to heart, because this could be any news article. This could be any title. This could be any event that's happened. But it's important. And it's important to be aware of this in terms of how your perception of this event can be affected. Because could there be an explanation behind each of these images that you see? Is there something more that's going on here than what you might think? Or is it really what it looks like? Is it an act of mercy? Is it an act of violence? Is it an act of control? Or is there something else going on? I will let you know that there is an official explanation for what you see in this image, and these are all the same images. Now, there's difference with the colorization. There's difference with the appearance. But this actually relates back to a story and an image that came from the Vietnam conflict. Now, in the United States, the Vietnam conflict was very controversial. It still is to this day, to even talk or think about it. And that's relatively recent history. And so there are people who did experience this conflict. And so why is it important to understand this for the recorder paradox and the historical revision? Because remember, the person that recorded this event is not the person who's going to interpret it historically in the future. So those are all important things to think about. The canteen had whiz in it. Yeah, are you referencing, what was it? I think it was season 3 of Game of Thrones there when they gave Jaime Lannister that. Yeah, I remember that scene too, Jamie. Reminds me of Anderson Cooper getting caught on his knees in water while he was filming live, saying it was up to his chest. Yeah, I still remember watching him when he went to Ramadi in Iraq, and there was an explosion that was probably about 10 miles away, and he very slowly ducked. That's my memory of good old Anderson there. But anyways. Hey, Miss Honeybee. Yes, I appreciate that. So let's just get that banner up there and go ahead and hit that like button. What's the difference between how we saw it? Well, what you have is you have uniformed military personnel here. How we saw it, it looks like it's just one individual who's about to face an imminent execution, or at least is being threatened by a weapon. But then how it really happened, you don't have that happening at all. And the actual account here is that this is an Allied soldier that's being treated by U.S. soldiers. Now, the reality is, yes, it's an Iraqi soldier who is being treated by U.S. Marines. This is from Operation Iraqi Freedom, as they called it. And he was just giving him some water in a canteen, which did happen. But there's more to this than what you just see in this image, because how other people saw it. Well, they just see the black and white image, and to them, it's very black and white. And so, yes, there's a difference between seeing what really happened. And why do I use the coloring mentality? Because there's extremes. Everyone always seems to think that everything is all or nothing. Reality is never all or nothing. There's always multiple dimensions to this. How other people saw it. Well, other people saw it as, yes, it's very clear cut. It's a U.S. soldier who's helping an Iraqi soldier who surrendered. Oh, this is how other people saw it. It's a U.S. soldier that was threatening to kill an Iraqi soldier who had surrendered or was helpless, disarmed. But in reality, they were just helping him out with some water and trying to keep him alive. So it's just one single event, though, that can have so many different dimensions to it. And then when you go forward in history, well, let's just hypothetically say some crazy things happen. The United States becomes seen as totally evil, and then, of course, this image gets pushed out. Then the United States becomes the forces for good, and it always shall be. Then this image gets pushed out. Although now they've gotten a lot more complicated with it because they operate on multiple paradigms where the whole intent is to sow division. There's division in national respects. There's division in ethnic respects. And there's even division in social respects and every form of knowledge you can imagine. And why do they do that? Because, again, it's confusion. Group identity is more important than individuality. Welcome to the 21st century. Now, of course, I have to throw in one image of Willem Dafoe. Willem Dafoe always seems to pop into explorations on this channel. Anybody know what film this is from? Speaking of strange military events. Snorted instead. Mountain Dew. Oh, that's a good one. Oh, yeah. And World War II turned out to be a much more dynamic conflict than we like to think. Ah, yes, right, all of ya. Platoon. Tom Berenger and Willem Dafoe, Staff Sergeant Barnes and Sergeant Elias. Oh, just you wait until we get to the Dr. Zaius exploration. That's going to be interesting. I worked in operations at the Seattle branch of a stock brokerage and lived through the crash of '87. I witnessed with my own eyes the reporter-photographer dumping several boxes of stock trade. Yes, indeed. And a lot of us witnessed a lot of things like that. But, of course, it's never captured. Nobody ever talks about it, do they? Until well after the fact. So, what's interesting about Platoon, and the reason I bring it up, is what a lot of people don't understand about Platoon. I mean, they understand it on reflection. But you'll find that some veterans really appreciate this movie. And I'm talking about Vietnam veterans. I'm not talking about other veterans. But Vietnam veterans that were there, it seems to go about half and half when you talk to them. Half of them appreciate the movie and the fact that it's really a microcosm, one platoon, for the entire conflict of Vietnam. But the other half don't appreciate it at all because you see some of the worst respects of what happened with certain service members over in Vietnam. You know, the war crimes thing, everything going on, randomly killing and terrorizing villagers, the whole rape, pillage, and murder, which was shown in this film. But then you contrast that, between the two sergeants, which kind of speak as the soul of the platoon. You've got a platoon leader, a lieutenant. It's completely ineffective and doesn't practice leadership whatsoever. You got a company commander who calls in fire on his own position when they're overrun, although granted, tactically, you could say he didn't have any choice. But the reason why this film stays in our memory, though, is that it really shows the different dynamics of humanity. But on the other hand, is it really so one way or the other way? Is it so polarized? Or, as the photo showed, because it's a bad cliche, and I'm not going to say it, but, the coloring of the photo. There's a lot more dimensions that go into this, and it's not so clear-cut. And suddenly history is not so all or nothing. But are we told that it's all or nothing? Yeah, he sure did. Run through the jungle, no doubt about it. No, and, I think, Julia, the reason why the film resonated with people was that it really gave you an idea of what it was like to actually go walking through a jungle for hours on end. And it's not a very enjoyable experience, to say nothing of the events that are happening. Whether you're getting attacked by fire ants, you're watching your friends get killed, or you're watching innocent people get killed. And that's something the film really showed quite well. So these are all terrible, horrible things. And we know war is a terrible, horrible thing, and yet for some reason we just keep diving on into it. I mean, now in the United States, we like to say, well, hey, at least we're not engaged in any wars ourselves. We're just helping other people fight wars. So that's kind of okay. Now, the other film that I didn't show, yeah, maybe it was, who knows. The other film I didn't show about Vietnam, but I've talked about it, is Apocalypse Now. And there's a great line in Apocalypse Now that Captain Willard, Martin Sheen's character, says that I think is very applicable. And one of the things he says is, you cut someone in half with a machine gun and you give them a Band-Aid. And there's a lot of truth in that, especially when you look at how military operations go with the United States. Really anybody, but we'll say the United States because that's who's being talked about. Uniforms. Why are they a thing in war? Good question, RB. Very good question. And sometimes the uniforms often look a lot alike. In fact, quite frequently they do, especially in certain time frames. So I have read Hearts of Darkness. Wonderful book. And that's what motivated Apocalypse Now. So yeah, and maybe there's a reason why you have such a clear insight, Fairy Girl. I mean, there's a lot of things that these Hollywood movies try to push people in certain directions, and I think you can use them to kind of step back. Yeah, it does break both ways. Groupthink, dehumanize. Yep. And so many people miss that whole concept in Full Metal Jacket because everybody thinks that Gunnery Sergeant Hartman is ultimately cool, but nobody pays any attention to the fact that he's the one who gets the Full Metal Jacket through his chest and dies very unceremoniously by a recruit that he thought was pathetic and weak. And you know the company commander would cover that one up. Oh, yeah, Gunnery Sergeant Hartman, he pushed him too hard. So anyway. Miracle at Santa Ana. Yeah, that's a good one. Yes, it is. And it's very surreal, too. I think that's what they really captured in that film. So anyway, back onto our original, what we're talking about with time paradox and recorder paradox and historical revision. You can see it, though, in all these examples. And there's plenty of Vietnam veterans who were firsthand witnesses to what happened in Vietnam. But can any one of them tell you exactly what the war was all about or what was going on? If Sergeant Elias survived and you could talk to him today, could he tell you what was going on or what it was all about? He had his ideas. If Sergeant Barnes survived and he came through and, had a scar on the other side of his face, would he be able to tell you exactly what it was all about? So those are important things to remember. Even when you have firsthand accounts, does it really clear everything up? And you might remember this little image that I used where we looked at Union Station in Kansas City and we talked about different historical accounts. Really, if I have a picture, I can put any caption with it and I can really get you to believe anything. You believe what you're told. This becomes your reality. That's why I always push questioning on the channel. It's important to question things. And people get tired of it. And as you all mentioned earlier, what happens is they're just willing to go along with the mainstream narrative. It's easier. It's just easier to go along with it. Ah, yes, everyone does have their own lens. You're right, Robert. I've worked with Vietnam veterans, and most of their stories was to do with Agent Orange. Very true, Chassis, and oddly enough, no reference to Agent Orange in either one of those Vietnam movies, even though it played such a huge role. There was that one movie in the 1980s that was actually made by, Trauma Team Films, and it was the same production group that made Toxic Avenger. They actually made a very serious movie, and we've talked about it before, and that movie was called Combat Shock. That was about a Vietnam veteran who's trying to integrate in the 1980s in New York City, or at least one of the boroughs, and not succeeding. And his child is also a victim of Agent Orange, and then he's got another one coming. So anyways, it just gives you that idea. There's a lot more to it, and yet one of the most essential events of Vietnam that affected the most veterans doesn't even get talked about in films. So again, make of that what you will. But that is absolute truth. Yep, Combat Shock. And no, I'm not going to recommend the movie, but it is a terrifying and brutal movie, and it's made on a shoestring budget. But yet they really conveyed the true horror of war, and then even more so, the real horror of genuine post-traumatic stress. Now, of course, that term gets thrown around, but what you really see it's coming from is that there are people that are trying to pull down this guy who's trying to reintegrate. So that's what the whole movie's about. Strategically transfer equipment to another location. Steal. Yes. Ever so true. And so this whole idea of historical revision, why does everyone refer to Tartaria in the old world? And you might remember these are the major theories that we have. And so we'll go to the next point. Theories of existence. Now, what's reality? Because now that we've questioned time, we've questioned history, we've questioned record keeping, because remember, record keepers and historians are not the same person. What are the theories of existence? And you may remember this slide if you haven't seen it. I know it's be the first time you've seen it in a while. But it talked about some of the major theories. History is not what we believe. The dates, years, and perception of events are altered from the objective truth. And we just established that they are altered. And the main theory of the channel, it's the 5 eras theory. It's another way of looking at what happened in history based on observations. But there are other ways to look at things. Now, how do you say that? Well, reality is solid, but the past has been altered. Our understanding of the past has been altered. So we have the 5 eras theory. And this is the main unified theory that we explore the most on the channel to explain Tartaria in the old world. Mass sacrifices to make a small group of people lots of money. True, Julia. Although, if you have total control over the money supply, or you say how much money there is, what do you even need to do the sacrifices for if it's not for money? Another whole question. Ah, yes, keep them confused and they'll argue forever. True enough. But that's why we examine that, the 5 eras theory. Are we living in a dream? Is it something else? I don't know. And then looking at the 5 eras theory, so breaking it down in the Foundation eras, the Tartarian Age, the Monument Dome era, and then the Contemporary era. Now, I'll just run through this real quick because the 5 eras theory, we've talked about it, you're relatively familiar with it, and if not, you can certainly go back and watch that video. But The Foundation eras, the earlier civilizations of humanity, which are referred to in many different documents, even official history, but then also in the Bible, legend, other sources. There were civilizations before us. How great were they? What kind of heights did they reach? Well, according to legends, they reached quite high. And so it goes along with the concept, the main component of our theory is that we've lost much capability. Our longevity in life, our creativity, our inspiration, our self-reliance. The Tartarian era, that's merely a name of tribute, because really, you can call it whatever era you want to, the era that preceded ours. But most of the remaining architecture we suspect is from that civilization. But we have Foundation eras, the star forts, the great retaining walls, the vast basements and underground complexes that we have that are below the buildings. And those are certifiable, observable, and repeatable on exploration facts. Then you have the contemporary era. Last 170 years. Now, is it really 170 years? I don't know. Was it around 1850? I don't know. Could have been around what we think of as 1930 for all we know. Keep that in mind. But photos, accounts, history, relocations of people, asylums of all types, all the remaining buildings are repurposed, and it's based on illusions of achievement. And you can see a picture of those illusions of achievement. Because what do we like to tout? Well, we like to tout about all the things that we did. Yes. And a good way to look at it, too. Atlantis was about the first most advanced civilizations. And no doubt, Chassis, it's a reference to that, because all the references to Atlantis do indicate that. And I like to say, one of the terms that I have, or one of the sayings I have, is that Atlantis is something that existed in the 1900s. Atlantis was Tartaria in the 20th century. Same thing. You're referring to the same thing, a previous civilization. Although I suspect that there were more, and they had more capability than we realize. But could there be something else behind it? Yes, reality could be a simulation, and anything is possible in the simulation. Now, you might remember this is the original 5 eras timeline that I had with the Golden Age and the Tartarian Age and Contemporary Age, and breaking it down into different eras. But we refined this. We moved on from it. And it might be possible that in the distant past, things were very different, that we had mega flora and fauna that existed, that this was a giant tree, that these were gigantic animals, gigantic, colossal people even. We just don't know. It's a theory. And it could have been in the very early eras, what we think of as the first or second era. That's the beauty about the 5 eras theory. It does make room for all these things to be possible. Now, it could be that, yes, this is merely just an old rock face. It's not a volcanic core. I always found that a little interesting. These aren't really the trunks of old trees, but maybe they are. Maybe these aren't the life forms of gigantic creatures in the past, but maybe they are. The 5 eras theory enables this to be encompassed. However, it could be because it's a simulation, because you're trying to figure out, well, what are the rules? Yeah, that's true. Or like that one film, Fantastic Planet. What is it built on? Yeah, that's a good question. Southeast Queensland is littered with ruined megastructures. Yep. And you'll find them all over the place, and you'll walk all over them and you won't even think twice of them. I didn't last very long, Robert. I mean, I tried to make it look like it was this bold, dramatic struggle. It really wasn't. Once I started going against it, I couldn't say what I was supposed to say anymore. But anyway, whether it's 5 eras or it's a simulation, because, while I think it's not as likely it's a simulation, there are signs that it could be a simulation. Oh, thanks, RB. I appreciate that. And so, whether it's a simulation or whether it's real, these are all things that we need to keep in mind, because these are all possibilities. And I always keep all these possibilities in mind every exploration. And I do find the simulation theory quite interesting. We have explored it. And why do you have Mandela effects? And I've had personal Mandela effects, and they don't apply to other people. There are some that do apply to other people. Fruit of the Loom, anybody? Where's the cornucopia? I don't know. And even talking about a yellow sun or a white sun. Now, you'll have people out there that'll relentlessly try to convince you that it's all just a giant psyop. And you know what? That may be true. But the problem is there's too many individual examples of the Mandela effect to ignore. You can't ignore it. There's got to be some other explanation. So could it be a simulation? Or could it just be the reality doesn't operate perfectly? You know, I know Matt over at Quantum of Conscience, he likes to call them reality breakdowns. And I think it's a great term because it does encompass what's going on, whether we're in an actual reality or a simulation. Well, what's the difference between the reality and simulation? That's another discussion. But it is something I actively consider, that we may be in a simulation. And it didn't exist. Maybe so, Chassis. No, I can see you, Texas. I can see you. You are there. Gotcha. Loud and clear. Or at least I can see your words just fine. No, very good point there, Paulie. Yes, a simulation is always a copy of something. But it's more than just a simulation. It could just be that reality is fluid. Now, is that because it's a dream? Well, it's a possibility, and we did explore that to various degrees of success. Or is it because there's a lot more control over the reality that we're not aware of for whatever reason? Quantum physics is right with different dimensions. Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of the baseline aspects of it, Fairy Girl. I really do. Oh, Adam, once again, brother, I swear you're reading my mind because you're jumping ahead here. Inception, yes. And Inception really showed a lot of these ideas. So, simulation, reality's fluid, we're all in a dream. You can bend it, like in the film Inception. You can run down Times Square, like Tom Cruise did, and get into your Ferrari, even though you actually have a Mustang. So consider all inconsistencies at once. Anything is possible and changes without warning. This includes the rules of physics. Yes, total malleability. Absolutely right. No, so true, Ronnie. We don't know. We don't know. We've got hints. We've got clues. Hey, Donna Marie, good to see you. Yeah, I know. And a lot of people don't like Tom Cruise, but it is an example, though, of the film that really encompassed how reality could be a lot more broken down than we realize and why it may be. So, hey, Leighton, have you considered the possibility of the reset being caused by the Carrington event of the 1859? Yes, I have. I don't think, though, that the Carrington event was actually the reset itself. I think observations of it were from the remnants. But again, we don't know. What's the year 1859? I don't know. I mean, but I don't think it's an all or nothing. Yes, the Carrington event, it happened, it didn't happen. I mean, you've also got the year without the summer. You've got all kinds of questionable things going on in that time frame. So it's really hard to say. But the problem, if you're trying to determine if reality is a dream or a simulation, you do notice these inconsistencies. You do realize that there are things that don't make a lot of sense. So how do I explain it? Well, is it a simulation that's broken? Is it a reality that's fluid? Not really sure. And then, of course, I'm sure the most popular one, and I do keep it in my mind. Reality is solid, the mainstream is more or less correct, and history happened exactly as stated. Now, why do I keep that on the table? Because it's always possible, and I can't rule out the possibility, but I can certainly rule out the likelihood. Because for members of the channel, reality can be both, a simulation and a simulation. Very true, Donna. And it can get a lot more, or Donna Marie, I'm sorry. It can get a lot more complicated than that. I mean, I'm keeping it very surface level in this exploration because I'm really just introducing the concepts that we do keep in mind as we do the explorations. That's the whole intent here. So, why do you think there's a lack of justice now in the world? Well, I think there's always been a lack of justice. It's just it's accelerated a little bit more, and now they can be a little bit more obvious about it. Yes, Occam's razor. And you know what's cool about Occam's razor, Brother Adam, is that it can cut both ways. The simplest explanation can be the explanation, but the complex explanation that nobody wants to consider, that could be the explanation as well. So does Occam's razor really provide an answer, or is it just a way of sending minds a certain direction? I'll leave that to you to answer, all of you. So anyway, but yes, I know the likelihood of the mainstream being correct diminishes, as I like to say, with every exploration. What's the media telling us today? Well, it's completely different than what they told us yesterday about anything and everything, so can't trust them. Ulysses S. Grant, he was a great general in the United States Civil War. His presidency left a lot to be desired. Of course, now historical revisionism, and it is damn well historical revisionism, is changing Grant's presidency. Oh, he wasn't a corrupt president. He just had some poor cabinet members. But, he meant well. He was a two-termer. He was a great president. I mean, did he even exist in the way that we think that he did? Well, don't ask those questions, okay? Look, this is Ulysses S. Grant. Clearly he existed. Now, there was a picture of some guy here wearing stars on his shoulders. Could he have been somebody important? Was it the same guy? Yeah, sure. Could he have been some commander that was rolling down what was really happening in what we think of as the United States at that time? Absolutely. Still no combat photos, but that's not to say combat wasn't happening. Probably just wasn't happening the way that we think of it as. And then, of course, my favorite, the Baker shot from Operation Crossroads in 1946. Yeah, take a look at this video footage. I'm not going to tell you what to think about it, but if you get the chance, just watch the video footage of the Baker shot from Operation Crossroads and tell me what you think. Please do it in the comments, though. But, main components of this theory, you can just research anything on Google, Wiki, newsfeed, sports, all you experience. Everything is just as they tell us. Even though I can prove it to you every single day, it's not. It changes depending on the day, doesn't it? There are no planets. They are wandering stars. Ah, lovely comment. Knowing is void of doubt. This is very true, Miss Honeybee. And it goes down to a lot of people needing to know. We need to have answers, so I'll just accept whatever answers I can get. Beat bop bop programming. Yeah, pretty much. Just march to the tune of the drum, right? So anyways. But the main issue I have, though, with the mainstream being correct, I think it's correct in some places. I really do. There are elements of it that are correct. So that's the other reason why I keep it on the table. But do I think it's painting the whole picture? Is it telling us what happened in totality? No. Not even close. We need reason, and people will believe what is comfortable. Unfortunately, Vaughn, that's absolutely right. And it goes back to the whole saying that people don't like to make decisions. People like to empower others to do that. They just want to be comfortable. Life just wants to be easy. Now, is that all of us? What you got here, Starline? The holographic universe. Reality is malleable. And that could be a distinct possibility as well. And especially if you look into Gnosticism, which a lot of people will deride, there's elements of that. Or watch the John Carpenter film Prince of Darkness. Anyway, so we'll move on. Courage and imagination. And the only reason I share this, and yes, these are two stills from one of my favorite films, the original Clash of the Titans. Don't get me started on the remake. I'm not going to get derailed with that. But courage, the ability to do something that frightens one. And yet people have different kinds of courage, but oftentimes courage can be subverted to do something terrible that you wouldn't do normally. And imagination, the faculty or action of forming new ideas. Now, the reason I bring both these up is that these are two concepts, these are two traits that in a lot of ways one's been subverted. So courage has been institutionalized in a lot of ways. You don't have individual courage anymore. And imagination. I don't think it's much argument to say that imagination has been deprived in this century. Quite a lot. And how can I prove that? Remakes, remixes, reimaginings, even the word itself. Add an S and you got a sequel or a remake or something. Hey, just think in 2040 we'll have the film Twisters. Just wait till you see that. Glenn Powell can come back and make the cameo appearance. Sorry, I just had to throw that one in there. Cavemen are real. Some have creative minds like humans, but cavemen are like parrots. Interesting. Nope, nothing new under the sun, but they always try to convince us that it is new under the sun, don't they? Especially this particular century. Why? Who knows? Now, probably one of the most important parts of this portion. I want to really get down to what are the main guidelines of the channel. And I don't impose a lot of guidelines or anything like that. What I like to do is I like to operate, though, with these set of boundaries. I seek to explore all these theories, prove or disprove them. I'm doing that actively every single exploration. So if you're really looking for my method, this is the one time where I'm going to explain it. And then people who come to the channel and don't understand how we're doing things, I'm going to refer them to this video or this live stream. So we seek to explore these theories, prove and disprove them. Always maintain objectivity. And you know what? I don't always maintain objectivity. I've got my biases. I'm a human being. I love the Iowa State Capitol. Okay, I'm not going to lie about it. But are there other structures out there that are more impressive, more beautiful, harder to explain? Absolutely. I mean, really, if I was living in Italy, you know what it would have been. It would have been the Florence Cathedral. Darn it. But I like the Iowa State Capitol, and it's good to have a baseline. But maintain objectivity. That's why I like talking to other people. That's why I like you expressing your opinion to me. It helps me maintain objectivity. And hopefully talking to each other, we maintain objectivity together. Reveal and share details of the land. There's a lot of things that we don't see. For example, in Dubuque, Iowa, a lot of people don't even realize there's a giant retaining wall with huge limestone blocks, or at least what we're informed is limestone blocks. I question that. Just one example. Encourage you all to seek your own answers. This is one of the most important ones. Because it's okay that you see things differently. It's okay that 10 of you out there might think we're in a simulation. It's okay that 50 of you out there embrace the 5 eras theory. It's okay that there's 10 of you out there that think the mainstream is correct. Because that's how we're actually going to seek our overall answers, is by being honest within ourselves and sharing all that information. That's how we keep asking questions, and that's how we find the truth. And no, it's not easy. It's really hard. But that's what gives us the challenge that we need. And this is the approach of the channel in a nutshell. I know that I know nothing or not enough. Ah, so true, Polly. So true. So yes, I know that comes back from my own personal history, that there's a method to my madness. This is the method to my madness, and this is how I operate in every exploration. So I don't even consider it healthy competition. I don't care about competition. Just like all of you, I want to figure out what's going on. It's that simple. It was the best Mad Max film, okay? It was. But anyway, so this is the method behind the channel. And that's what's evolved into the current 5 eras theory. And pretty much every exploration that I do, everything is put within the 5 eras theory. Now, the 5 eras theory does operate under theory number 1, that there is an objective reality, but there are glitches to it, or there are areas where it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so you can encompass most of everything by explaining that some of the things that we see are from the foundation eras, whether it's the megaflora, the megafauna, the gigantic buildings, the great tree stumps, the very large animals that might have been colossal beyond our imagination. Totally possible in the first era, maybe even the second era. But then in the third and fourth era, we do actually see remnants that are out there that are recognizable to us. Now, for example, if you saw the Dubuque exploration, I believe that the retaining walls are something left over from the third era. I believe that the star forts are something left over from the third era. Could I be wrong? Absolutely. And then the fourth era is most of the structures that we still see, whether it's a state capitol, a church, a cathedral, or all the other repurposings that we have for those buildings. And then when our contemporary era. So all the explorations fall under those broad guidelines. Now, is that to say that I don't consider it's a simulation, it's a broken reality, there's some entirely other explanation? Absolutely. And yes, I do consider that the mainstream may be correct. In fact, I tend to start every exploration by saying this is what the mainstream tells us, and then we start looking at it and examining it. So that's the real approach behind the channel, but this 5 eras theory is the main theory where you have Tartaria and the old world. And we'll continue to evolve it as we go. Oh, thank you, Sooner West. And you know what? And you might be getting that airship a little bit sooner, so I appreciate it. Half-buried windows is the only proof we have that started this whole mud flood movement. We have the right to know, but no one dared to ask. So true, Noah. So true. A beautiful land of creativity instead of competition like today. And perhaps a world where the individual was balanced with society, where you could actually attend to the needs of the individual, but not undermine the society in doing so. Okay, but it better be a Ford Falcon. Sorry, I get more Mad Max fans all the time. So anyway, that's the entire concept of how the channel operates.